There is a battle that saved a continent, and almost no one knows its name. Not in the way they know Midway, not in the way they know Normandy, or Stalingrad, or the fall of Berlin. Those battles have their monuments, their anniversaries, their place in the cultural memory of nations. But this one, fought over warm, open water in the spring of 1942, between fleets that never once laid eyes on each other, tends to drift past people, a footnote in the larger story, a prelude to something bigger. That is a mistake, and tonight we are going to correct it. Because what happened in the Coral Sea across those first days of May 1942 was not a footnote, it was a hinge. One of those rare, quiet moments in history where the direction of an entire war, the fate of an entire continent, and the lives of millions of people turned, not with a great dramatic flourish, but with the grinding, exhausting, often chaotic work of sailors and airmen and code breakers and commanders trying to outthink each other across hundreds of kilometers of featureless ocean. It was the first naval battle in history where the opposing ships never saw one another. No broadsides exchanged across a narrowing strip of water. No gunners staring down iron sights at an enemy hull. The weapons were aircraft, launched from floating airstrips into uncertain skies, and the admirals who commanded those fleets might as well have been conducting a battle in the dark, guided by fragmentary intelligence, garbled radio reports, and an almost painful degree of uncertainty about where the enemy actually was. And yet, somehow, out of that fog, out of those errors and missed opportunities and moments of outright absurdity, something decisive emerged. Japan's march south was stopped. Port Moresby held. Australia, for the first time in months, could breathe. Tonight's documentary is called The Untold History of the Battle of the Coral Sea. And if you are settling in for the night, if the lights are low, if you are comfortable, if you are ready to let a story carry you, then you have come to the right place. This is the kind of history that works best in the quiet hours, the kind that unfolds slowly, letting you feel the weight of each decision, each mistake, each act of courage, performed by ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances. We are going to take our time with it. We are going to do it justice. So if this is your first time here, welcome. Hit subscribe before we go any further, because we cover exactly this kind of history on this channel. The battles that changed everything, told in the depth and the detail they deserve, at exactly the pace a long night calls for. And if you have been here before, then you already know what we are about. Settle in, get comfortable. We have got a long and remarkable story ahead of us. Now, let us set the scene. By the spring of 1942, the war in the Pacific had already become something that defied easy comprehension. In the space of just a few months, beginning with the attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, 1941, Imperial Japan had executed one of the most breathtaking campaigns of military conquest in modern history. Not one victory, not two. A cascading, seemingly unstoppable sequence of them. Guam fell, Wake Island fell, Hong Kong fell. Malaya was overrun in a campaign so swift and so expertly executed that it stunned the British officers who had spent years believing the peninsula was defensible. Singapore, the great fortress of the British Empire in the east, the stronghold that was supposed to anchor Allied power in Asia, surrendered in February of 1942 in what Winston Churchill would privately call the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. More than 80,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops laid down their arms. The shock of it reverberated around the world, and Japan did not stop there. The Dutch East Indies, the vast archipelago of islands rich in oil and rubber, that the Japanese war machine desperately needed, were seized with almost contemptuous ease. Burma was falling. The Philippines were fighting a desperate rearguard action that everyone already knew was doomed. Rabaul, on the northeastern tip of New Britain, had been transformed in weeks from a quiet colonial outpost into the most powerful Japanese naval base in the Southwest Pacific. And then there was Australia. Australia, which had sent so many of its sons to fight in North Africa and the Middle East under British command. Australia, whose northern cities were now within range of Japanese bombers. Darwin had already been struck on the 19th of February 1942 in a raid carried out by the same aircraft and many of the same pilots who had attacked Pearl Harbor just 10 weeks earlier. The psychological effect was profound. For the first time, the war was not somewhere else. It was arriving. In Canberra, there was fear. In the streets of Sydney and Melbourne, there was fear. Cables flew between the Australian government and London, and between Canberra and Washington, carrying an urgent and increasingly desperate question: where are the limits of Japanese ambition? Is there a point at which this advance stops, or does it simply continue, south through New Guinea, through the Torres Strait, onto Australian soil itself? It is worth pausing on that question for a moment, because it was not a hysterical question. It was a rational one. The pace and the scale of what Japan had already achieved gave every reason to take the possibility seriously. The Allied commanders who had underestimated Japan in December of 1941 had paid for that underestimation in catastrophe after catastrophe. Nobody wanted to make that mistake again. And in Tokyo and Truk and Rabaul, Japanese planners were already answering the question, not with reassurances, but with orders. The next move was taking shape. It had a name. It had a timetable. It had carriers and cruisers and troop transports already being loaded and fueled. It was called Operation MO, and its objective was Port Moresby, the last major Allied base in New Guinea, the gateway through which any advance toward Australia would have to pass. If Port Moresby fell, the strategic position of Australia changed entirely. Japanese air power would reach across the Torres Strait. Allied supply lines would be in mortal danger. The southern continent would be more isolated than it had been at any point since the war began. Japan believed it was a nearly risk-free operation. Japan believed the American carriers were either sunk or out of position. Japan believed that by the time anyone could respond, Port Moresby would already be in their hands. Japan was wrong. But the story of why they were wrong, the codebreakers who saw them coming, the admirals who raced to intercept them, the pilots who fought and died above warm equatorial water, the carrier that burned and sank and took her place in history, that story deserves to be told in full. It deserves the night. This is the Battle of the Coral Sea. Let us begin. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a map room when the news arriving from the front is consistently, relentlessly bad. In the early weeks of 1942, that silence was spreading across Allied headquarters, from Washington to London to the raw, nervous city of Canberra. A silence made not of calm, but of disbelief, held together by sheer discipline. The Pacific Ocean, the largest body of water on the surface of the Earth, stretching across more than 160 million square kilometers, had become in a matter of weeks a vast, accelerating catastrophe for the Western powers. What had seemed, even to pessimists, like a war that might settle into a long, grinding defensive stalemate, had instead become something closer to a rout. The Imperial Japanese military machine was not advancing. It was rolling, and nothing placed before it seemed capable of slowing it down. For the men and women tasked with understanding what was happening and deciding what to do next. The maps told a story that was very difficult to look at directly. It had begun, of course, in the pre-dawn darkness of the 7th of December, 1941, in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor on the Hawaiian island of Oahu. The attack itself, carrier-launched, carefully planned, and executed with a precision that its targets had not believed possible, had struck the United States Pacific Fleet at its moorings and, in less than 2 hours, reshaped the strategic balance of the Pacific. 8 American battleships were sunk or heavily damaged. More than 300 aircraft were destroyed on the ground and in the water. The human cost was devastating. Yet even in the immediate shock of Pearl Harbor, American naval leadership understood something that would only become fully clear in the months ahead. The attack had missed the Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers, which had been at sea that morning. That absence would matter enormously. But in the weeks that followed, the consequences of Pearl Harbor were not abstract strategic calculations. They were a cascade of disasters that seemed to compound with each passing day. Within hours of Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces had struck across a vast arc of the Pacific and Southeast Asia simultaneously, with a coordination and scale that left Allied commanders struggling simply to track what was happening, let alone respond to it. The Philippines came under attack within hours, and General Douglas MacArthur's air forces on Luzon were largely destroyed on the ground, a failure so complete it would haunt American military thinking for years. Guam fell within days. Wake Island, defended by a small garrison of Marines who fought with extraordinary determination, held out until the 23rd of December, when it was finally overwhelmed. Far to the west, Japanese forces had crossed the Thai border and were pressing south through the Malay Peninsula with a speed that British planners had believed the jungle terrain would make impossible. The confidence that had underpinned British imperial strategy in Asia for decades was evaporating, exposure by exposure, position by position. The fall of Singapore on the 15th of February 1942 was perhaps the single most devastating blow to Allied prestige in the entire Pacific campaign. The island fortress had been called impregnable so many times, and by such authoritative voices, that the claim had become a kind of psychological infrastructure. The belief that Singapore would hold was load-bearing, and when it did not hold, something very large collapsed along with it. More than 80,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops surrendered to a Japanese force that was, in many respects, smaller and materially inferior to the force it had defeated. It was not merely a military defeat, but a shattering of an entire worldview. The idea that Western military power in Asia rested on unassailable foundations. For Australia in particular, the loss of Singapore cut deep, because Singapore had been the cornerstone of the imperial defense strategy that Australia had been assured would protect it. That cornerstone was gone, and Australia stood looking southward across its own coastline with fresh eyes. By that same February, the Dutch East Indies, today's Indonesia, were crumbling under the weight of the Japanese advance. The islands held oil, rubber, and resources that Japan desperately needed to sustain its war economy, and the Japanese military moved to seize them with systematic efficiency. Allied naval forces attempted to contest the advance in a series of engagements across the Java Sea and its approaches, fighting with courage but without coordination, without adequate air cover, and without realistic hope of success against an enemy that had local superiority at every critical point. Ship after ship was lost. The American, British, Dutch, and Australian naval coalition that had formed to hold the East Indies dissolved under sustained pressure, and by early March, the Indies were effectively in Japanese hands. The speed of it was numbing. Nations that had held territories in the region for generations had lost them in weeks. Rabaul, on the island of New Britain, at the northeastern tip of the island chain, curving toward mainland New Guinea, fell on the 23rd of January, 1942. The town had a magnificent natural harbor, one of the finest in the Southwest Pacific, and the Japanese recognized immediately what it could become. Within weeks of its capture, Imperial Japanese engineers and naval forces were transforming Rabaul from a small colonial port into a major fortified base, a hub from which air power, naval forces, and invasion convoys could be projected across an enormous radius. It was from Rabaul that the next phase of Japan's southern advance would be organized and launched. Its capture meant that New Guinea, the vast, jungle-covered island that lay just to Australia's north, was now within easy reach of Japanese land-based air power. The distance between the war and Australia itself had shrunk from the theoretical to the concrete. In Australia, the fear was not abstract. It was present in newspaper headlines, in government briefings, in conversations between families who had already sent sons and brothers and husbands to the Middle East, and now watched another war arrive on their doorstep from the opposite direction. The bombing of Darwin on the 19th of February 1942, a raid involving more than 188 Japanese aircraft, larger in scale than the attack on Pearl Harbor, announced with devastating clarity that Australian territory itself was now within range of Japanese air power. Darwin was not a symbolic target. Its port, its airfields, and its fuel stores were real military infrastructure, and the attack on it was a real military operation. 8 ships were sunk in the harbor, hundreds were killed. The raid silenced any remaining argument about whether Australia faced a genuine threat of invasion. Prime Minister John Curtin had already used the word that other Allied leaders were still carefully avoiding. Writing in late December of 1941, he had stated plainly that Australia looked to America for help, free of any pangs as to the traditional ties that had always bound Australia to Britain. It was an extraordinary declaration, a rupture with decades of strategic assumption made in plain language by a man who understood that plain language was what the moment required. Churchill was furious, but Curtin was reading the strategic situation with clear eyes. Britain could not defend Australia. It was struggling to defend its own home waters. America was the only power with the scale, the industrial base, and the geographic proximity that gave any realistic hope. But America was still reeling, still counting its losses, still building the war machine that would eventually tip the balance. In the meantime, Australia waited. The question that haunted every Allied planning conference in the first months of 1942 was not whether Japan would continue to advance. It was where, and when, and through which avenue. The Japanese had demonstrated a capacity for simultaneous operations across enormous distances that no one had fully anticipated. Each time Allied planners felt they had identified the next likely target, events on the ground or at sea moved faster than the analysis. Japan held the initiative completely and seemed entirely comfortable exercising it. Its forces were not pausing to consolidate. They were pressing, always pressing, testing the edges of what was possible and finding, again and again, that the edges were farther out than anyone had expected. The strategic logic pointing toward New Guinea and its southern coast was not difficult to read, even for exhausted planners working on inadequate sleep in inadequate buildings, with maps that were sometimes weeks out of date. Port Moresby, the principal town on New Guinea's southern coast, sat roughly 500 kilometers from the tip of Australia's Cape York Peninsula. An airbase at Port Moresby, in Japanese hands, would place northern Australia under sustained aerial threat, and would fundamentally complicate any Allied attempt to use Australia as a base from which to stage a future counteroffensive. More than that, a Japanese presence on New Guinea's southern coast might be the opening move of something larger, a severing of the sea lanes between Australia and the United States that would leave the continent strategically isolated, dependent on whatever forces were already there, unable to be meaningfully reinforced. That was the nightmare scenario, and in the first months of 1942, nightmare scenarios had a way of becoming Tuesday's news. What no one in those map rooms could yet see, what no one would understand until long after the fact, was that a check was coming. Not a thunderous, decisive reversal, not a liberation or a turning point that would announce itself with clarity. Something quieter and stranger and harder to read. A battle in an ocean most of the world could barely locate on a map, fought by aircraft that would never see the ships they were attacking, resulting in a tactical outcome that would look on paper like a Japanese victory and function in history as something very different. The Coral Sea was still weeks away. The carriers were still in port. The code breakers were still working, sorting through fragments of intercepted signals, trying to hear the outline of an operation through the noise of a language they had not yet fully learned to read. And somewhere in the vast machinery of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a plan called Operation MO was already moving from proposal to preparation. Its ambitions aimed squarely at the island, whose name had become a symbol of everything the Allies were trying to hold. By the spring of 1942, Japan's military planners were operating from a position of almost intoxicating confidence. In less than 5 months, the Imperial Armed Forces had shattered the American battle fleet at Pearl Harbor, seized Malaya and Singapore from the British, overrun the Dutch East Indies, driven the Americans from the Philippines, and swept across a vast arc of the Pacific and Southeast Asia with a speed that left the Allied world reeling. Every objective set in the original war plan had been met, and met ahead of schedule. The men who had drawn up those plans now gathered in Tokyo to ask a question that would have seemed reckless just a year earlier. Where next? The answer, for the Imperial Japanese Navy's most ambitious strategists, pointed south. Australia had emerged in Allied thinking as the great anchor of resistance in the Pacific, a continent-sized base from which the United States and its partners might eventually stage a counteroffensive northward through the island chains. Japanese planners understood this clearly. If Australia could be isolated, deprived of American reinforcement, or brought to the negotiating table by the threat of invasion, the entire Allied position in the southern Pacific could collapse without a single Japanese soldier setting foot on Australian soil. The key to achieving that isolation was a place most Australians had barely heard of, Port Moresby, a small harbour town on the southern coast of New Guinea, sitting just over 400 kilometres from the Australian mainland across the Torres Strait. Port Moresby occupied a position of extraordinary strategic weight. Allied aircraft operating from its airfields could reach Japanese shipping lanes and staging bases throughout the Southwest Pacific. More critically, as long as the Allies held it, they could threaten any Japanese advance further south, and they could use it as a springboard for eventually pushing back north through New Guinea toward the Philippines and beyond. Japanese planners recognized that capturing Port Moresby would extend their defensive perimeter southward and push Allied air power back far enough to make the northern approaches to Australia nearly untenable. In Japanese hands, those same airfields could instead be turned against Allied positions, deepening the isolation of the continent and bringing the pressure of Japanese air attack down onto Queensland's northern towns and ports. The plan that emerged from these calculations was given the designation Operation MO. It was a layered, multi-pronged operation that reflected both the sophistication of Japanese naval staff work and, as events would prove, a dangerous overconfidence in its own complexity. The operation called for an invasion convoy to sail from Rabaul, the great Japanese fortress base on the northeastern tip of New Britain, and make for Port Moresby directly. A separate, smaller landing force would first seize Tulagi in the southern Solomon Islands, establishing a seaplane base that would extend Japanese reconnaissance coverage over the Coral Sea. Covering all of this would be a strong naval force, including fleet carriers, tasked with destroying any Allied naval response before it could interfere with the landings. On paper, the plan was methodical and thorough. In practice, it would demand precise coordination across hundreds of kilometers of open ocean. The man chosen to oversee Operation MO at the operational level was Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, commander of the 4th Fleet, headquartered at Truk. Inoue was a thoughtful officer, some would say overly cautious, with a reputation as a naval aviator and administrator rather than a frontline fighting admiral. He believed strongly in the power of land-based air and was less instinctively aggressive than some of his contemporaries. He would command the operation from shore, directing its various components by signal rather than flying his flag at sea. This arrangement would later prove significant. When decisions needed to be made quickly in the heat of battle, Inoue would be physically and psychologically removed from the action, shaping outcomes from a distance rather than through the immediate situational awareness of a fleet commander. The striking power of Operation MO rested on 2 fleet carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, veterans of the Pearl Harbor attack, and among the finest warships afloat. These were not second-tier vessels, scraped together for a secondary operation. They were formidable ships, each carrying dozens of aircraft, crewed and maintained by experienced men who had already proved themselves against the American Pacific Fleet. Together, they formed the 5th Carrier Division, assigned to the striking force under Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi, a surface warfare officer whose experience with carriers was more limited than his rank implied. Takagi would direct the overall naval covering force, while the actual air operations fell to Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara, a more experienced aviator commander, who flew his flag aboard Zuikaku. The relationship between these 2 men, and the chain of command running from both back to Intoe on Truk, would introduce a layer of coordination friction into the Japanese plan that planners in Tokyo had not fully accounted for. Providing closer support to the invasion convoy itself was a lighter covering force, built around the small carrier Shoho. She was a converted vessel, carrying a fraction of the aircraft that Shokaku and Zuikaku could field, but she was considered more than adequate for the task of providing combat air patrol over the transports as they moved toward Port Moresby. The assumption underlying her assignment was straightforward. The heavy carriers would deal with any Allied naval interference before it could reach the convoy, and Shoho would handle whatever air threats might emerge in the meantime. It was a logical division of responsibility. It was also a division that would leave the invasion force more exposed than planners realized. Japanese intelligence estimates added to this mood of confidence. Allied naval strength in the Coral Sea region was assessed as modest and likely to remain reactive rather than aggressive. The American carrier force had not mounted any significant offensive action in the Southwest Pacific since the outbreak of the war, and there was no particular reason to believe it would suddenly appear in strength now. The loss of multiple American battleships at Pearl Harbor had, in Japanese thinking, effectively neutralized American offensive capability for the foreseeable future. The remaining Allied forces, Australian cruisers, a handful of American warships, land-based aircraft operating from airfields in Queensland and New Guinea, were judged insufficient to seriously threaten a well-escorted invasion convoy protected by two of the Pacific's most powerful carrier groups. The operation was not seen as a gamble. It was seen as a matter of routine execution. That confidence was not entirely without foundation. Japan's carrier aviators had, by this point, accumulated a record of success that gave any honest observer reason to respect their capability. The attacks on Pearl Harbor, Ceylon, Darwin, and across the East Indies had demonstrated an ability to project air power over vast distances with skill and coordination. The aircraft types involved, the Mitsubishi Zero fighter, the Nakajima torpedo bomber, the Aichi dive bomber, were, at this stage of the war, superior in various respects to their Allied counterparts. Japanese aircrew, particularly those assigned to the fleet carriers, had trained for years and had now been seasoned by months of actual combat. The forces assembled for Operation MO were not improvised or under strength. They were confident professionals, carrying the momentum of an unbroken run of victories. And yet, running beneath this confidence, certain assumptions had gone unexamined. The Japanese naval staff had not seriously modeled what would happen if American carriers appeared in the Coral Sea in meaningful numbers before the invasion convoy reached its objective. The plan's architecture assumed the striking force would be able to neutralize Allied air power in a single decisive engagement, and that the timing of the operation would prevent any significant Allied buildup in the region. There was no real contingency for a scenario in which the Allied command not only knew the operation was coming, but had already positioned carriers to intercept it. That scenario was not considered likely. Given the state of the war as Tokyo understood it, it seemed nearly impossible. The invasion convoy assembled quietly at Rabaul in the first days of May 1942, transports loaded with troops, their decks riding lower in the water under the weight of equipment and ambition. On the long southern horizon, beyond the visible arc of sea, the carriers of the 5th Carrier Division were already moving to take up their assigned covering position. Nobody in those planning rooms, and nobody standing on those weathered docks at Rabaul, watching the transports prepare to sail, could see what was already in motion on the other side of the horizon. The codebreakers had been listening, and the American carriers were already at sea, while Japanese invasion convoys were still loading their cargo, and carrier decks were still being painted with the rising sun. Something extraordinary was happening in a basement in Hawaii. Not on any beach, not in any jungle, and not aboard any warship, but in a low-ceilinged room, thick with cigarette smoke and the quiet, relentless scratch of pencil on paper. The men who worked there had no guns. They had code books, traffic logs, and the particular kind of stubbornness that refuses to accept the word impossible. What they were attempting, reading the sealed private communications of an enemy navy mid-war, in near real time, had never been done at this scale before. And yet, in the weeks before the first aircraft ever flew over the Coral Sea, they were already close. Closer, in fact, than the Japanese High Command could have imagined or would have tolerated had they known. Station Hypo sat beneath the 14th Naval District headquarters at Pearl Harbor, and its formal name told almost nothing about what actually happened inside. The work was cryptanalysis, the painstaking art of breaking codes, and the man responsible for it was Commander Joseph Rochefort, a figure who defied almost every expectation of what a naval intelligence officer was supposed to look like. Rochefort was known to work in a bathrobe and carpet slippers. He slept on a cot in the basement for days at a time when the pressure demanded it, which was often. He was brilliant, abrasive, politically difficult, and he trusted the instincts of his team more than the conventional wisdom arriving from Washington. In early 1942, his team was working against a Japanese naval code known as JN-25, a system of enormous complexity that had already defeated lesser efforts. They had not broken it entirely. They never claimed to have broken it entirely. But they were reading enough of it to begin hearing something. A pattern, a shape, the outline of an intention forming inside the traffic. The work of code breaking is not like finding a hidden door and walking through it. It is more like listening to a conversation through a thick stone wall. You hear rhythm before you hear words. You hear stress before you hear meaning. And sometimes all you have is the fact that a particular voice is speaking more urgently than usual. What Rochefort's analysts were intercepting in late March and early April of 1942 was exactly this kind of indirect intelligence. Japanese naval message traffic in certain geographic sectors was increasing. Specific call signs, which the codebreakers had learned to associate with particular fleet units, were appearing in new combinations. Logistical traffic, the administrative noise of an operation being assembled, was spiking in ways that suggested something larger than a raid was being prepared. The content of individual messages remained partially obscured, but the shape of something was becoming visible, the way you can sometimes see the outline of an object through frosted glass, without yet knowing exactly what it is. The designation that kept appearing in intercepted traffic was a two-letter combination that analysts eventually rendered as MO. It appeared in conjunction with references to a geographic area that, through painstaking cross-referencing with known Japanese place name substitution codes, the team began to associate with the Southwest Pacific. Port Moresby itself was referenced under a coded label, and while the Americans did not immediately know what that label meant, they tracked it consistently enough that its importance became unmistakable. Other designators appeared alongside MO, indicators that pointed toward troop transport movements, toward carrier air groups, toward a timeline that seemed to be approaching rather than receding. Rochefort's team was working from fragments. Each fragment alone meant almost nothing. Assembled together, they began to suggest something that could not be ignored. There was no single moment of breakthrough, no dramatic instant when a final key turned and all meaning flooded in. The intelligence picture built slowly, over days and weeks, through accumulation. One analyst would identify a familiar call sign appearing in an unfamiliar operational context. Another would note that the volume of encrypted communications between Rabaul and Truk had doubled in a fortnight. A third would observe that references to a particular geographic designator had begun appearing in traffic previously associated with offensive fleet movements, rather than routine patrol operations. Rochefort held these threads together, pushing his team relentlessly, sleeping too little, arguing with his superiors in Washington, who sometimes preferred their own reading of the same data. The picture that emerged was incomplete. It had gaps, it had ambiguities, but it had a direction. By late April of 1942, Rochefort and his team were confident enough to bring Admiral Chester Nimitz a warning that had genuine operational weight. Their assessment was not a certainty. They were careful about that. It was an estimate that Japanese forces, including carrier units, were assembling for an offensive operation in the Southwest Pacific, likely aimed at Port Moresby, likely to occur sometime in early May. The carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, were assessed as part of the striking force, as was a lighter carrier element likely tasked with direct support of an amphibious landing. The warning identified Tulagi, in the southern Solomon Islands, as a probable preliminary objective, a seaplane base that would extend Japanese reconnaissance coverage into the Coral Sea. It named, in outline, what Operation MO was, weeks before any Japanese aircraft would be spotted, and weeks before the first shot was fired. Nimitz was a man who understood the nature of probabilistic judgment, in a way that not all commanders did. He had seen, at Pearl Harbor, what happened when warning intelligence was available and not acted upon. He was not going to repeat that history. At the same time, he was operating in a world of genuine scarcity. The American Pacific Fleet was still bleeding from the 7th of December 1941. The carriers he had, Yorktown, Lexington, Hornet, and Enterprise, were his most precious strategic assets, and committing them on the basis of incomplete intelligence carried its own potentially catastrophic risks. If Rochefort's assessment was wrong, or if the Japanese operation was a deception designed to draw American carriers into an ambush, Nimitz could lose half his remaining carrier strength in a single afternoon. The decision he faced was not simply military. It was epistemological. How much should a commander trust intelligence that he cannot fully verify? In a war where every major resource is irreplaceable, he chose to act, not with everything he had, but with enough. Nimitz ordered Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher and Task Force 11 under Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch to proceed to the Coral Sea. He ordered MacArthur's land-based air command in Australia to increase reconnaissance sorties over the northern approaches. He did this without knowing the precise composition of the Japanese force, without knowing the exact date of the planned landing, and without any guarantee that the intelligence picture Rochefort's team had assembled would hold together under the pressure of actual events. He accepted the uncertainty and moved anyway. This was, in its own quiet way, one of the most consequential command decisions of the entire Pacific War, made not in the heat of battle, but in a staff office, over a set of maps and signals intercepts, with a cool and deliberate willingness to act on imperfect knowledge. What Nimitz did not share widely was the source and nature of the intelligence that informed his decision. The secrecy around signals intelligence was absolute, or as close to absolute as the pressure of war allowed. The codebreakers at Station Hypo could not be publicly credited. Their work could not be referenced in operational orders in ways that might allow a captured document to betray to the Japanese that their codes were being read. The warning that drove the American carriers into the Coral Sea was invisible to almost everyone who received its consequences. The sailors who would fight and die in those waters in the first week of May 1942 did not know why their fleet had been sent there, or how it was that American admirals seemed, improbably, to have a sense of what was coming. Secrecy of this kind is its own particular burden. To do a thing that matters enormously, and to be unable to say that you did it. There is something quietly remarkable, not in the hollow, overused sense of that word, but in its original meaning of worthy of remark, about the contrast between the two forces now converging on the Coral Sea. On one side, a Japanese naval machine of extraordinary discipline and power, confident in the secrecy of its communications and the surprise of its intentions, moving through the Pacific with the momentum of a force that had not yet been seriously checked. On the other side, an Allied fleet already outnumbered and outgunned, moving not in blind response, but in forewarned preparation, guided by the invisible work of exhausted men in a basement who had read the future in fragments of encrypted radio traffic. The Japanese believed the element of surprise was theirs. It was not. The Americans had it, or at least a version of it. The particular advantage that comes from knowing someone is coming before they know you know. The intelligence that Rochefort's team produced was never complete. It was never certain. It named a target, not a guaranteed outcome. It gave Nimitz a direction, not a script. The battle ahead would be shaped by weather, by mechanical failure, by miscommunication, by the fog that settles over every engagement between professional forces once the first aircraft lifts from the first flight deck. The codebreakers had not predetermined the result. They had simply created the conditions under which a result other than catastrophe was possible. Without them, there would have been no American carriers in the Coral Sea when the Japanese arrived. Without them, Port Moresby would have fallen with no one in position to stop it. The men in the basement in Hawaii, bleary-eyed, underfed, certain of nothing except the intelligence they had built piece by piece from silence, had already changed the course of events before a single torpedo left its tube. The orders came down through encrypted channels, clipped and precise, carrying the full weight of what Nimitz had decided. 2 American carrier task forces, operating independently across an ocean vast enough to swallow navies whole, were to converge on the Coral Sea and intercept an enemy whose plans were only partially understood, whose exact position was unknown, and whose strength on any given day might exceed whatever the Allies could put in front of them. For the men receiving those orders aboard their respective flagships, the mission must have felt something like being asked to find a specific needle in a field of haystacks, in the dark, in the rain, with someone else looking for you at the same time. There was no margin for hesitation, and no comfort in waiting. Nimitz had made his choice. Now it fell to 2 admirals and their sailors to execute it. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher commanded Task Force 17, built around the carrier USS Yorktown. Fletcher was a surface warfare officer by background, a man who had come to carrier command through the brutal on-the-job education that the Pacific War was forcing on everyone. He was cautious by temperament. Critics would later call him overly so. But caution in an ocean as unforgiving as this one was not always a weakness. His task force had already seen action in the early, difficult months of the war, launching raids that accomplished little in material terms, but bought time and kept the Japanese off balance. Now, he was being asked to do something considerably more consequential. Fletcher steered Yorktown south and west, into waters his charts could describe in depth and current, but could not describe in danger. Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch commanded Task Force 11, built around the carrier USS Lexington. Where Yorktown was a fleet carrier of relatively recent construction, Lexington was older, larger, and in the way of certain ships, possessed of something that her crew treated almost as personality. She had been converted from a battlecruiser hull in the 1920s, an improvisation born of treaty limitations, and she showed her origins in her size, a great grey presence on the water, longer than many of the warships that would fight alongside her. Fitch was a genuine aviator, one of the Navy's early converts to carrier warfare as the decisive medium of naval combat. He and Fletcher made an interesting pairing, one man learning the art, the other already convinced of it. Between them, they were about to fight the most important battle of the Pacific War to date. The 2 task forces did not sail together. The distances involved, the logistics of fuel and supply, and the basic need for tactical flexibility meant they moved separately, with plans to rendezvous at a designated point in the Coral Sea before the enemy's timetable closed. The rendezvous point itself existed only as a set of coordinates on a chart, a pinprick of imaginary geography on an ocean that stretched in every direction toward horizons that looked identical. Getting 2 separate fleets to the same place at roughly the same time, while both were underway across several hundred kilometers of open water, was a feat of seamanship and communication that deserved far more credit than it typically received. It required trust in the accuracy of dead reckoning, trust in weather forecasts that could evaporate by morning, and trust that the enemy had not already anticipated the plan and moved to cut off one force before the other could arrive. Fueling at sea was perhaps the most unglamorous and yet operationally critical challenge facing both task forces. Carrier operations devoured fuel at a rate that could empty bunkers with startling speed, and the Coral Sea lay far enough from established Allied bases that neither Yorktown nor Lexington could sustain combat operations without taking on oil from fleet oilers at sea. The process required two vessels, one enormous and wallowing, the other alive with wartime urgency, to come alongside each other at matching speeds, close enough to pass hoses across the gap between hulls, while the ocean did everything in its power to make the maneuver dangerous. Swells could push the ships together or tear the hoses free. Wind could spin a vessel sideways at the worst possible moment, and all of this had to be accomplished while anti-submarine patrols circled overhead and lookouts watched the horizon for the periscope feather that would end the exercise permanently. It was brutal, necessary, exhausting work, and it happened before a single shot was fired. For the sailors below decks during those days of transit, the war existed mostly as vibration and rumor. The engines pushed the ships through swells at a pace designed to save fuel while still making schedule, and the motion of a carrier at sea was something a man either learned to ignore or never quite managed to. Hammocks and bunks swayed with a rhythm that some men found hypnotic and others found nauseating. The ship's public address system parceled out information carefully, neither too much nor too little, enough to keep morale functional, not enough to let fear take root in the gaps. Meals were served, watches were stood, aircraft were readied and rearmed and inspected and readied again. The routines of seamanship ran like a clock beneath the surface of the anxiety, giving men something deliberate to do with their hands, while their minds turned over the questions that had no answers yet. The pilots who would fly the strikes, if and when the enemy was found, carried a particular kind of tension. They gathered in their ready rooms, small, close spaces below the flight deck, thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of men spending days in close quarters, and they studied charts, reviewed recognition profiles of Japanese vessels, and rehearsed in their minds the geometry of attack runs that existed so far only in theory. They knew their aircraft. They knew, or believed they knew, what they would face. What they could not know was how Japanese anti-aircraft fire would actually feel at close range, how enemy fighter pilots would respond, or whether the training they had received was sufficient for what the Pacific War was actually asking of them. The actions at Tulagi, a few days earlier, had offered the first uncomfortable evidence that precision bombing from altitude against small, maneuvering targets was considerably harder than practice runs had suggested. Fletcher and Fitch were also navigating something less tangible but equally real, the problem of intelligence. The code breakers at Pearl Harbor had given them the general shape of the Japanese plan, an invasion force bound for Port Moresby, covered by carriers and land-based aircraft. But the precise positions of the Japanese carrier groups, the exact timing of the invasion convoy's departure from Rabaul, the specific routes the enemy forces intended to follow, all of this remained murky, subject to interpretation, liable to change. Fletcher had to choose how to position his forces based on estimates, not certainties. Move too far north, and he might expose himself to land-based Japanese aircraft from Rabaul without the benefit of surprise. Move too cautiously, and the invasion convoy might reach Port Moresby before he could intercept it. The Coral Sea was not a small theatre. It encompassed hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of open water, and finding an enemy who did not want to be found required a combination of intelligent positioning and plain luck. The Allies were not fighting alone in these waters, though the extent of the coalition was easy to underestimate. Australian and American land-based aircraft from airbases in Queensland and New Guinea flew reconnaissance patterns over the Coral Sea, Bismarck Sea, and Solomon Islands, reporting ship sightings and relaying intelligence that filtered back to Fletcher's staff. These searches were imperfect, Weather could ground aircraft, reports could be delayed, and the identification of ship types from altitude was an art, requiring experience that many crews had not yet fully developed. But they extended the Allies' eyes significantly beyond what carrier-borne search planes could cover alone. Every piece of information mattered, and every delay in receiving it mattered equally. What gave the American operation its fragile coherence was trust. Trust in Nimitz's judgment in committing the fleet. Trust between two task force commanders who needed to cooperate without being able to confer face-to-face, and trust in the intelligence that had told them the Japanese were coming at all. Nimitz had made the bet without knowing whether the hand was strong enough to win. Fletcher and Fitch were the ones now carrying that bet forward across open water, in ships that could not be replaced quickly, with crews who could not be replaced at all. The stakes were real, in a way that planning maps and memoranda could not fully communicate. If the intelligence was wrong, or if the timing miscarried, or if the Japanese proved stronger than anticipated, there would be no reserve to call upon. The Pacific Fleet had almost nothing left to spare. The Coral Sea received them without ceremony. It was a body of water defined not by geography, but by function. The space between Australia's northeastern coast and the island chains to the north, through which supplies and reinforcements flowed, and through which, if Japan had its way, the next blow against the Allied position in the Pacific would be delivered. Surface vessels on such a crossing saw mostly the same thing day after day. Sky, horizon, swell, the white trail of the ship's wake stretching back toward where they had come from. Somewhere ahead, beyond the reach of any lookout's eye, the Japanese fleet was moving too. The distance between the two forces was narrowing with every hour, with every watch, with every meal eaten, and every engine revolution turned beneath the waterline. Both sides had committed. The question now was not whether they would find each other, it was only when and what would happen in the moment of contact, in that first terrible exchange of aircraft and fire and decision, out on an ocean where there was nothing to retreat to and nowhere to hide. Rabaul sat at the northeastern tip of New Britain, like a fist clenched around the throat of the Southwest Pacific. Its harbour, one of the finest natural anchorages in the entire region, curved in a wide, sheltered arc formed by the flooded caldera of an ancient volcanic system, the surrounding peaks still smoking faintly, as if the earth itself had never quite forgotten its own fury. Before the war, it had been a quiet colonial town, a place of corrugated iron rooftops and tropical gardens, of German heritage and Australian administration, of copra traders and mission schools, and the unhurried rhythms of a world that seemed very far from the great capitals of Europe and Asia. By the spring of 1942, all of that was gone. In its place stood something altogether different, a fortress, a nerve center, a machine of conquest operating at full pitch. The Japanese had seized Rabaul in January of that same year with brutal efficiency, sweeping aside the small Australian garrison in a matter of hours and recognizing immediately what nature had provided them. They would not waste it. What the Japanese built at Rabaul in the weeks and months that followed was a military installation of extraordinary scope and ambition. Engineers worked through the tropical heat to expand the existing airfields and begin construction of new ones, so that by the time Operation MO was being drawn up, Rabaul could sustain dozens upon dozens of land-based aircraft, bombers, fighters, and flying boats, capable of reaching targets across an enormous arc of ocean and jungle. The harbour filled steadily with warships, cruisers swinging at anchor, destroyers refueling at the docks, transports loading supplies and soldiers in the suffocating equatorial heat. Supply lines ran back north, through Truk, Japan's great mid-Pacific naval bastion, and forward through a chain of smaller outposts that the Japanese were busy fortifying with the same methodical energy they brought to everything. From Rabaul, Japan could look south toward New Guinea and see not a barrier but a highway, and at the end of that highway lay Port Moresby. Port Moresby was the objective that gave the entire operation its meaning. Sitting on the southern coast of New Guinea and facing directly across the Torres Strait toward the Australian continent, it was the last significant Allied position, standing between Japan's expanding perimeter and the northern shores of Australia itself. Whoever held Port Moresby held the high ground of the entire southwestern theatre. Its airfields could cover the approaches to Australia, could threaten Allied shipping across the Coral Sea, and could serve as the forward base for whatever the Japanese chose to do next. Allied planners in both Canberra and Washington understood this with cold clarity. So did the architects of Operation MO. Capturing Port Moresby was not merely a tactical ambition. It was the keystone of a strategic arch that, once complete, would leave Australia dangerously exposed and the Allied position in the Pacific dramatically weakened. The question was not whether Rabaul had the means to launch such an operation. The question was whether the Allies had the means to stop it. The Japanese plan that emerged from the deliberations of the Imperial Navy's 4th Fleet headquarters was layered in a way that reflected both confidence and genuine strategic sophistication. It was not a single thrust, but a coordinated, interlocking series of movements, each element intended to complement and protect the others. At its heart was a Port Moresby invasion convoy, a group of transports carrying soldiers of the South Seas Detachment, escorted by cruisers and destroyers, tasked with making the passage around the eastern tip of New Guinea and delivering their troops to the beaches south of Port Moresby. This convoy was the reason for everything else that would follow. Every warship stationed, every aircraft fueled, every carrier dispatched was ultimately in service of getting those transports safely to their destination. The soldiers aboard them would do the final work that maps and strategy could only plan. To protect the invasion convoy from air attack, as it made its exposed passage, the Japanese assembled what they believed would be an adequate covering force. The light carrier Shoho was assigned to this role, a small but capable vessel that could provide combat air patrol over the convoy and deal with any Allied aircraft that managed to locate the formation before it reached its objective. Shoho was not a powerful ship by the standards of the major fleet carriers, but she was considered more than sufficient for the task at hand. After all, the Japanese did not yet know that 2 American fleet carriers were already moving into the Coral Sea to meet them. From the perspective of the planners at Rabaul and at 4th Fleet headquarters, the covering force arrangement was prudent and well designed. They had reason for that confidence. Everything they had attempted in the preceding months had succeeded, but the Japanese plan contained a heavier punch than Shoho alone. Providing the true strategic muscle of the operation were 2 of the Imperial Navy's finest fleet carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku. These were among the most powerful ships afloat, large, fast, and crewed by aviators who had trained for years and had already proven themselves at Pearl Harbor and across the Indian Ocean. Together they formed the 5th Carrier Division, a force that the Japanese fully expected would neutralize any Allied naval interference before it could threaten either the invasion convoy or the broader success of Operation MO. Shokaku and Zuikaku would not escort the transports directly. Instead, they would operate as a striking force to the east and north, positioned to intercept and destroy any Allied surface or carrier force that dared to contest the operation. In the minds of the planners, they were the insurance policy, and a generous one at that. Separate from these main elements, a smaller but strategically important detachment was dispatched to Tulagi in the southern Solomon Islands. This group, built around seaplane tenders, was tasked with establishing a seaplane base that would extend Japanese reconnaissance reach far to the south and east, providing the early warning and maritime patrol coverage that the wider operation would need to succeed. Tulagi was a stepping stone, modest in itself, but its value as a surveillance platform in the outer waters of the Coral Sea was considerable. Occupying it would give Japan eyes across a vast stretch of ocean, allowing them to track Allied movements and vector their forces accordingly. Its seizure was planned as the operation's opening move, a swift preliminary action to be completed before the main thrust toward Port Moresby began. It was neat, logical, and entirely sensible. Or so it appeared in the planning rooms at Rabaul. The convoy itself began its preparations with the organized, purposeful haste that characterized the imperial military in its season of confidence. Soldiers moved aboard the transports in the heavy tropical air, carrying weapons and equipment up gangways, while overhead, the Rabaul sky pulsed with the sound of aircraft engines being tested and run up at the airfields ringing the harbor. Land-based bombers were assigned patrol routes over the approaches to the Coral Sea, tasked with scouting ahead of the fleet and with striking any Allied bases that might threaten the operation's flanks. The coordination required was formidable. This was no simple amphibious landing, but a multi-layered naval and air operation, stretched across hundreds of kilometers of open water and jungle-covered coastline, timed to a schedule that left little room for error or delay. The Japanese had executed such operations before, repeatedly and successfully. There was no compelling reason, from where they stood, to expect this one to be any different. What made the plan feel so secure to its architects was the broader context in which it existed. Japan had not suffered a meaningful strategic reverse since the opening of the Pacific War. From the wreckage of Pearl Harbor through the fall of Singapore and Rangoon, from the conquest of the Dutch East Indies to the devastating carrier raids into the Indian Ocean, the record of Japanese arms had been one of almost unbroken success. Enemy fleets had been shattered, enemy fortresses had fallen, Allied commanders had been outmaneuvered, outfought, and forced into retreat at every turn. The Imperial Navy entered the spring of 1942 with the institutional confidence of a force that had not yet learned what its limits were, and in that confidence lay both its greatest strength and a vulnerability it had not yet recognized. Operation MO was being planned by men who had every reason to believe in their own invincibility, and almost no reason to fear the kind of surprise that was already being prepared for them thousands of kilometers to the east, in a basement in Hawaii. And yet, even as the transports loaded their soldiers and the carriers worked up steam in their moorings, the operation carried within it the seeds of its own complication. The plan depended on timing, on each element arriving where it was needed, when it was needed, on the invasion convoy making its passage without serious interference, on Shoho's air cover being adequate, on Shokaku and Zuikaku being available to neutralize any Allied carrier threat before it became critical. Timing, in war, is the one thing that the enemy's actions can most easily destroy. The Japanese planners had drawn their lines on a map with the precision and confidence of men who believed they controlled the variables. They did not yet know that several of those variables, including the knowledge that 2 American carriers were already at sea and closing, had already slipped beyond their reach. The plan was not flawed in its conception. It was flawed in its assumptions, which is a quieter kind of flaw, and a more dangerous one. Out of Rabaul, then, the pieces of Operation MO began to move. The transports edged out of the harbor and formed up in convoy, their destroyer escorts taking station around them. The covering groups spread across the sea in their designated formations. Far to the north and east, Shokaku and Zuikaku turned south, their flight decks lined with aircraft, and their crews going about the efficient, practiced routines of a fleet that had not yet tasted defeat. Ahead of all of them, unseen and unknowing, the waters of the Coral Sea stretched out in the late-season light, blue and enormous, and seemingly empty, concealing nothing, offering everything. It was into this ocean that the full weight of Japanese ambition now moved, deliberately and without hesitation, toward an appointment with an adversary they did not yet know was waiting for them. The 3rd of May, 1942, began quietly enough across the southern Solomon Islands. A small Australian garrison had been watching Tulagi for days, reading the signs the way soldiers learn to read them, the distant drone of aircraft, the altered patterns of shipping, the radio silence that speaks louder than any broadcast. When Japanese warships appeared off the coast that morning, the Australians did not wait. They had no meaningful defenses to speak of, no prospect of holding the island against what was coming. They withdrew, and Tulagi fell with almost no resistance. Japan had its seaplane base. The southern Solomons had changed hands in a matter of hours. Across the Coral Sea, in the operations room of a carrier task force that had been at sea for days, a message arrived that would change the shape of everything that followed. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher received the report of the Tulagi landings aboard USS Yorktown, while his force was still hundreds of kilometers to the south, taking on fuel. The timing was, in one sense, deeply inconvenient. Refueling at sea was slow, methodical work, and Fletcher had been ordered to conserve his force, to husband his carriers, to wait for the full Allied striking power to assemble before committing to any action. But Fletcher was not a man who could look at an open target and calculate reasons to leave it alone. Tulagi was vulnerable. The Japanese landing force was still at anchor, still unloading, still exposed. The window was narrow and closing. He made his decision quickly. Yorktown would break off from the tanker, turn north at speed, and attack at first light the following morning. It was precisely the kind of bold, unscripted aggression that his superiors in Hawaii had hoped he might show. Whether it would prove wise was another question entirely. Yorktown drove north through the night at high speed, her crew moving through the familiar pre-strike preparations that were, for many of them, still unfamiliar in practice. The pilots ran their briefings. The ordnance crews worked in the dim red light of the hangar deck, checking, loading, rechecking. The ship's cooks fed everyone who would eat, understanding from long tradition that men about to fly into combat should not fly hungry. There was no way for the men on that ship to know what was waiting above Tulagi Harbor. There had been no reconnaissance overflight, no photographic intelligence of the anchorage, no precise count of Japanese vessels or their dispositions. Fletcher was flying partly blind, trusting in the surprise of his arrival and the firepower of his air group to overwhelm whatever they found. The fog of war had not yet lifted. It rarely did. The first strike launched in the early morning hours of the 4th of May, 1942. Yorktown's aircraft rose into the sky in waves. Dive bombers, torpedo planes, and escorting fighters climbing away into a grey tropical dawn and turning north toward the Solomons. The pilots could see the islands from a distance as they approached, dark humps of green rising above the water, the harbour nestled between them. Below, Japanese ships sat at anchor or moved in the confined waters. The attack came out of low cloud, which both helped and hindered. It masked the American approach until the last moment, but it also broke up the attacking formations and made coordinated strikes difficult to execute. Pilots who had trained together in clear Pacific skies now found themselves hunting targets through broken cloud, alone or in pairs, improvising in ways their training had not anticipated. The results of that first wave were mixed, and in some ways sobering. The dive bombers attacked with determination. But the ships in the harbor were not fleet carriers or heavy cruisers. They were destroyers, minesweepers, small transports, maneuverable, quick to respond, and far harder to hit from altitude than anything the pilots had faced in a training environment. A destroyer turning hard at speed presents an extraordinarily narrow target to a pilot diving through scattered cloud and anti-aircraft fire. The American air crews had trained extensively, but training cannot fully replicate the combination of speed, fear, noise, and spatial disorientation that accompanies a combat dive on a shooting, turning ship. Bombs fell close. Some fell very close. But the ratio of hits to effort expended was lower than anyone had hoped, and the debriefs that followed would reveal patterns of error, release angles misjudged, speed miscalculated, runs broken off too early. Fletcher launched a second wave before the first had fully returned. The tempo he was setting was aggressive, even reckless by some measures, and the questions being raised by his operations staff about ammunition expenditure and aircraft serviceability were being answered with more strikes rather than fewer. The second wave found a somewhat different situation in the harbor. Some Japanese vessels had already gotten underway. Others had shifted anchorage. The element of surprise that had existed in the early morning was gone, replaced by alert gun crews and ships with steam up and maneuverability restored. The American torpedo planes pressed their attacks with real courage, flying low and straight through accurate anti-aircraft fire at the precise moments when a torpedo run demands absolute steadiness. But the torpedoes, the same weapons that had plagued the American submarine force and would continue to plague it, were not performing as designed. Runs that should have found their marks ran shallow, ran erratic, or failed to detonate on impact. The torpedo problem was not new information to anyone who had been paying attention, but seeing it play out in a real attack, watching pilots risk their lives on weapons that let them down, gave the failure a different quality than the cold language of a technical report. The men flying those torpedo planes knew, as they pulled away from their runs, that something had gone wrong, and they knew it, with the particular bitterness of men who had done everything correctly, only to be betrayed by the machinery they depended on. It was a frustration that would echo across the Pacific War for more than another year. But on this morning, above Tulagi Harbor, it was simply another entry in the account of a strike that was not going the way anyone had drawn it on a planning board. A third wave launched and attacked as the morning matured into afternoon, each successive strike building a picture of both what American naval air power could and could not yet do. Dive bombing, in particular, was proving to be a more refined skill than months of training had produced. The Dauntless dive bomber was a capable aircraft, and the doctrine it flew was sound in its broad principles. But putting a bomb precisely onto a fast-moving, sharp-turning small vessel from high altitude required a kind of practiced, instinctive calculation that experience alone could develop. Some pilots were finding it, others were not. The most experienced section leaders were demonstrating clearly what was possible when skill and nerve combined properly. But even their accuracy was well below the rates that would later be achieved by the same units after many more months of combat experience. The strikes on Tulagi were, in a sense, the Pacific War's first real classroom. When the aircraft returned and the tallies were drawn up, the accounting was modest relative to the effort. Japanese destroyers and smaller vessels had been damaged. A few ships had been sunk, though none of them represented major military losses to the Imperial Japanese Navy's overall strength. The harbor had been hit hard enough to accelerate the Japanese completion of their base, but not hard enough to drive them out or destroy the installation. Fletcher had expended an enormous quantity of ordnance and flying hours for results that were tactically limited. The criticism, when it came, and it came, focused on the profligacy of the attacks and the disproportion between effort and outcome. Some of the harshest assessments came from within Fletcher's own staff, but the significance of what had happened at Tulagi operated at more than one level. Fletcher had demonstrated something important, that when American carriers spotted an opportunity, they would attack without waiting for ideal conditions. That willingness to close with the enemy and strike, even imperfectly, even at risk, was a quality that would prove essential in the months ahead. The strikes had also confirmed something the American Navy needed urgently to understand about its own readiness: that the gap between peacetime training and wartime performance was real, that it had to be closed through combat experience, and that closing it was going to cost something. Every bomb that missed a destroyer above Tulagi was expensive tuition, but it was tuition being paid before the examinations that truly mattered. The action also carried a warning that Fletcher passed up the chain of command with his after-action reports. The Japanese would not be struck twice without being ready. Whatever advantage of surprise had existed on the morning of the 4th of May above Tulagi Harbour was now spent. The larger forces to the north, the carriers, the cruisers, the invasion convoy bound for Port Moresby, had been alerted. They were moving. They were searching. The battle that had opened with a speculative lunge at a seaplane base was now taking on its full shape, and both sides were maneuvering toward each other across a vast, empty sea, each trying to find the other before being found. Fletcher turned Yorktown south to rejoin the rest of his force. The opening shot had been fired. What followed would be of an altogether different order. The 4th of May 1942 dawned over the Coral Sea as an ordinary day of empty horizon and mechanical routine. But nothing in those waters was truly ordinary. Two fleets, separated by distance but bound by destiny, were moving toward each other through an ocean that seemed vast enough to swallow any enemy whole. Admiral Fletcher's task force, with the Yorktown at its core, had swung northward after the strike at Tulagi, still radiating the confidence of unopposed action. Several hundred kilometers to the northwest, the Japanese carrier fleet was advancing southward, their powerful strike force intact, and their commanders convinced that American opposition would be light, disorganized, and easily overcome. Neither side knew exactly where the other was. Neither side, in those hours before contact, truly understood the weight of what was about to unfold. The Coral Sea in May was not a pristine stage for battle. It was a realm of sudden weather, patches of rain squall that appeared like ghosts on the horizon, and cumulus clouds towering thousands of feet into the air. These clouds would become both shield and curse, hiding ships one moment and revealing them the next, complicating every attempt at precise navigation and accurate reconnaissance. The sea itself seemed to mock the efforts of both fleets to find each other, to bring order to chaos, to exchange blows before the other side could scatter or escape. Search and reconnaissance drove the 4th of May like a nervous heartbeat. Both fleets dispatched aircraft into the murk, single-engine reconnaissance planes, and slow, lumbering flying boats that carried observers, cameras, and radio operators, hungry for any sign of the enemy. These search missions were the eyes of the fleets, fragile and limited, and easily deceived. An American scout plane launched at dawn reported contact with Japanese ships, a sighting that sent Task Force 17 into a frenzy of excitement and preparation. Pilots were roused from their ready rooms. Engines were fired to warm. Ordnance was loaded, and the ship's company stood by in anticipation of the launch order. But as the morning progressed, the report became confused, then contradicted by other sightings, then dismissed as unreliable. Had the scout actually seen enemy carriers, or merely a transport group, or even ships of their own side? The fog of war was thickening, Similar confusion reigned on the Japanese side. Their reconnaissance aircraft spotted American vessels, but struggled to report with precision their position, composition, and movement. Radio signals were garbled or incomplete. Positions were estimated, not confirmed. The Japanese commanders, accustomed to acting on incomplete intelligence and trusting their instincts, nevertheless felt the weight of uncertainty. They knew the Americans were somewhere near. They did not know exactly where. By afternoon on the 4th, the weather had deteriorated further. Rain squalls moved across the sea like curtains being drawn across a stage, obscuring visibility to a few hundred meters. The sea itself grew rougher, with swells that made flying operations more difficult and navigation less precise. Both fleets attempted to maintain formation while executing search patterns, each ship's captain acutely aware that the weather that concealed him also concealed the enemy. The American pilots were young, many of them seeing combat for the first time. The Japanese pilots were experienced, the veterans of months of continuous operations in China and across the Pacific, but they too were flying in conditions that tested their skill and their nerves. Search aircraft returned to their carriers, with reports that seemed to contradict one another. A contact near Tulagi, a contact to the north, a contact to the west. Which was real, which was phantom. The tension aboard the carriers was almost palpable, that peculiar combination of fear and anticipation that grips men who know that battle is very near, but not yet engaged. Officers gathered around, plotting tables, trying to make sense of the fragmentary and often contradictory information flowing in from the search planes. The sun hung low in the western sky, and no decisive action had been taken. Both fleets had moved closer to each other, but they remained separated by distance and cloud, by rain and the merciful obscurity of a sea that did not yet wish to reveal its secrets. The 5th of May opened with the same conditions, the same urgent searching, the same frustrating inability to achieve the decisive contact. Throughout the morning and into the afternoon, both fleets sent their aircraft out in expanding waves, searching across hundreds of square kilometers of empty ocean. The American searches were somewhat more organized, coordinated through Fletcher's task force command structure, but they were also less well equipped than their Japanese counterparts, with shorter-range aircraft and less sophisticated search procedures. The Japanese searches were longer-ranged, but suffered from poor coordination between the air groups of the different carriers and the land-based reconnaissance forces operating from Rabaul and other airfields. This was a weakness that would not become fully apparent until contact was finally made. The hours of the 5th wore on without decisive engagement. Both fleets inched closer without knowing it. The sea itself remained largely hidden beneath its blanket of weather, a realm of uncertainty and near miss. Late in the afternoon of the 5th, one of the Japanese search flights finally achieved what both sides had been seeking, a clear sighting of the American task force, with coordinates that seemed reliable and preliminary identification of the vessels involved. The Japanese command made the decision to slow their advance and hold position, preparing for a coordinated dawn strike that would catch the Americans at first light on the 6th of May. The momentum of events had shifted. Fate was taking hold of the officers and men on both sides, drawing them toward the collision that could no longer be avoided. The night of the 5th fell over the Coral Sea, with all the weight of anticipation that precedes combat. Both fleets knew now that the other was near, though exact positions remained uncertain. The American ships moved through darkness with their crews at a heightened state of readiness, officers aware that Japanese aircraft might come at any moment, though experience suggested that carrier attacks in darkness were difficult and unlikely. The Japanese fleet held its position, the carrier's flight decks becoming sites of feverish preparation as ordnance was loaded, engines were warmed, and pilots received their final briefings for the strike scheduled for dawn. Neither side slept easily that night. The sea heaved gently beneath the hulls, and above, stars wheeled through a sky partly clear and partly obscured by drifting clouds. Men lay in their berths or on the decks, thinking of home, thinking of the chances of survival, thinking of the unknown. Some had seen combat before and carried with them the bitter knowledge of how quickly life could be extinguished at sea. Others were experiencing their first taste of immediate danger and could only imagine what the morning would bring. The radio circuits hummed with routine traffic, course corrections, position reports, and weather observations. The machinery of the fleets continued its relentless operation, turbines turning beneath the decks, fuel oil flowing through pipes, compressed air hissing through systems designed to sustain ships of war through the violence of battle. The hours between darkness and dawn on the 6th of May seemed stretched, longer than any ordinary night. Both fleets were now close enough that the span of ocean between them could be crossed by aircraft in roughly an hour's flying time. The hunters were near the hunted, but which side was which remained an open question. The American task force maintained its formation, with the carriers at the center, surrounded by their screen of cruisers and destroyers, a geometric arrangement designed to protect the most valuable ships from air attack. The Japanese carrier force, despite its apparent advantages in strength and experience, was itself somewhat scattered, with elements separated by distance and not moving as a single coordinated unit. This fragmentation was born partly from the complexity of the operation, partly from the difficulty of maintaining precise formation in open ocean, and partly from a fundamental belief among the Japanese that their carriers were so powerful that they did not need to fear concentrated opposition. As the night deepened toward the early morning hours, the tension aboard every ship in both fleets began to reach a crescendo. Men were called to battle stations earlier than usual. Anti-aircraft crews manned their guns. Fighter pilots were roused from sleep and led to their aircraft for the dawn combat air patrol. Radar operators, now more common on American ships than on Japanese vessels, watched their screens with the intensity of men who knew that the blips that appeared there meant life or death. The sea remained dark and largely empty. The vastness of the ocean reasserted itself in those hours before dawn, the same vastness that had made finding each other so difficult, so nearly impossible, and yet now they were found, or almost found, and the morning would bring the reckoning. This fog of war, this state of uncertainty and incomplete knowledge that gripped both fleets during the 4th and 5th of May was as much a danger as any enemy action could be. A ship that believes it has contact with an enemy when it has merely found a friend can open fire on its own. A fleet that acts on false information can place itself in a more dangerous position than it would have occupied by doing nothing. The human mind, faced with uncertainty, tends to fill in the gaps with assumptions, with hopes, with fears. What you expect to see, you often see, whether it is really there or not. The commanders of both fleets in the Coral Sea were experienced men, but they were also men operating with incomplete information, trying to make decisions that could send thousands of people to their deaths, based on fragmentary and often contradictory reports from aircraft, from radio intercepts, from informed guesses about where the enemy was likely to be. The American commander Fletcher had the advantage of intelligence from the codebreakers, but he did not know the full picture of the Japanese strength. The Japanese commanders had a general understanding of American strength, but had underestimated American resolve and overestimated their own operational security. The result was a state of mutual uncertainty that persisted right up until the moment when aircraft from one side finally saw aircraft from the other, when the fog of war began at last to disperse, and when decision could finally give way to action. The weather continued to play its ambiguous role, helping and hindering in equal measure. The rain squalls that obscured vision also obscured position. The clouds that made navigation difficult also made defense more difficult. The very conditions that had made it so hard for both fleets to find each other were the same conditions that would make it hard for them to communicate their findings and to coordinate a response. By the morning of the 6th of May, the search aircraft would be out again. The reconnaissance planes and the observation flights that served as the eyes of the carriers. And somewhere over the Coral Sea, these aircraft would finally see each other. When they did, when at last the fog of war began to lift, the battle would truly begin. But in those hours of the 4th and 5th, in the darkness and the rain and the vast empty ocean, there was only the grinding of ship machinery, the pulse of radar, the whispered conversations of men waiting, and the slow, inexorable movement of two carrier forces toward the collision that neither could now avoid. The tension that built during those 2 days was not merely military tension, the professional awareness of danger that trained officers experience as they prepare for combat. It was something deeper and more personal, a recognition among the men of both fleets that their lives had changed, that they were no longer part of a distant war, but were now personally present at a moment that would be recorded by history, though no one aboard these ships could possibly know what history would say about it. The ships themselves, the great carriers and their screening vessels, seemed to sense the approaching storm. Paint was touched up, minor repairs were made, ammunition was checked and rechecked. The routines of peacetime sailing were sharpened into the routines of war. The food served to the crew was plain but hearty, the understanding being that men about to face danger should be well fed. Below decks in the engine rooms, the engineers maintained constant vigil over their machinery, knowing that the speed and power of their ships might determine the outcome of the battle to come. On the flight decks, the mechanics and ordnance men made their final checks of the aircraft, knowing that a single loose wire or a poorly loaded bomb could be the difference between success and failure, between survival and death. The 4th and the 5th of May, 1942, were days of preparation, days of searching, days of frustration, and growing certainty that the die was about to be cast. Both fleets moved through their fog of war with the knowledge that clarity would come, that the vast empty ocean would soon become a battlefield, and that nothing would ever be the same again. In the pre-dawn hours of the 7th of May, 1942, the American carriers in the Coral Sea were hunting blind. The Japanese were doing the same. What neither side knew was that a relatively small Japanese warship, not a fleet carrier, but something far more vulnerable, was about to become the focal point of history's first coordinated carrier strike, and, more significantly, the first Japanese carrier ever to be sunk by American air power. The light carrier Shoho, displacing barely 9,000 tons and equipped with fewer than 30 aircraft, was steaming north as part of the Japanese covering force for the Port Moresby invasion. She was fast, maneuverable, and well designed for her role, but she was also alone, separated from the heavier fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, and this separation would prove catastrophic. The Shoho had spent the previous day providing air cover for the Japanese seaplane tender and bombardment group, operating around Tulagi. Now, on the morning of the 7th, she was steering northwest, her aircraft ready to launch, unaware that American search planes were already combing the sky for exactly such a target. The discovery came through the fog of war, as so many things in this battle did. American scout aircraft from both Yorktown and Lexington had been launched before dawn, each searching over a vast sector of the Coral Sea in the hopes of locating the Japanese fleet. The morning sky was thick with cloud, broken intermittently by clear patches, and the visibility was never good for long. But at around 8 o'clock in the morning, an American search pilot radioed back to his carrier with a contact report. Enemy ships bearing northwest, distance roughly 100 kilometers. The report was fragmentary, uncertain of the target's exact composition, but it was enough. Both Admiral Fletcher aboard Yorktown and Admiral Fitch aboard Lexington understood immediately what they had been given: an opportunity. The order went out across both carriers to prepare a strike. Pilots who had been waiting since before dawn began checking their aircraft, gunners loaded ammunition, and on the flight decks, the organized chaos of launch preparation commenced. Within minutes, a combined strike force of nearly 100 American aircraft was being readied. Dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighter escorts from both carriers. The weather was deteriorating, the cloud cover thickening, but that only added urgency to the decision. There was no time to wait for perfect conditions. The strike force from Yorktown launched first, climbing into the morning sky in a roaring sequence of takeoffs that lasted nearly half an hour. The Lexington's aircraft followed in their own formation. The two groups would not fly together. They were coordinating by radio and radio compass, but the sky was too crowded and the enemy too close for perfect formation flying. 93 American aircraft were now airborne, flying at different altitudes and on slightly different headings, all converging toward what their commanders hoped was the Japanese Shoho. The pilots had been given coordinates, but the ocean below was vast and featureless, broken only by the white lines of wave caps and the occasional squall. The tension was palpable, even across the distance of radio waves and the hours that stretched between launch and contact. Fighters flew above the bombers and torpedo planes, scanning the clouds for Japanese aircraft that might contest the strike. But as the minutes ticked past, no enemy fighters appeared. The Shoho, it seemed, was defended only by her own anti-aircraft guns and a handful of her own fighter aircraft. For the American air crews, there was a strange mixture of relief and anticipation. They were going into combat without the paralyzing fear of enemy fighters, but they also knew that surprising the enemy meant everything. One mistake in navigation, one missed course correction, and the strike would disperse across empty ocean, with nothing to show but empty fuel tanks and the long swim home. And then, through a break in the cloud, the lookout spotted her. The Shoho appeared below them, steaming northwestward in relative calm, her flight deck visible and clear, the ship's superstructure recognizable even from altitude. The American pilots who saw her first must have understood instantly what they had found. This was no destroyer, no transport, no secondary target. This was a warship of real significance, a carrier capable of launching aircraft against them. And now she was within range, and they had the altitude advantage. The radio crackled with confirmations and attack orders. The Yorktown's dive bombers rolled over first, peeling away from their formation and beginning their steep, screaming dives toward the small carrier below. The sound of engines under full throttle filled the cockpits, the rush of diving aircraft creating a kind of furious momentum that was almost hypnotic. The Shoho's captain saw what was coming and ordered evasive action, trying to turn hard and twist the ship away from the incoming attackers. But there were too many, coming from too many angles, with nowhere near enough time to escape. The first bombs started falling, small black shapes that grew larger and larger until they impacted the flight deck and the surrounding structure. Explosions bloomed across the ship's length, flames shooting upward, smoke pouring from the impacts. The Shoho was being overwhelmed. The torpedo bombers came next, approaching from a different vector, trying to position themselves for the kind of attack that could be most devastating. A run along the side of the ship where multiple torpedoes could strike the hull below the waterline. The Shoho's anti-aircraft gunners were firing desperately, their guns making the sky around the torpedo bombers dangerous, and several American aircraft were hit. But the sheer weight of the American attack was irresistible. Torpedo after torpedo was released, the pilots pulling up hard once they dropped their weapons and racing away toward the safety of altitude. Some torpedoes went wide, some hit the water and detonated uselessly against empty ocean, but others struck true, punching into the Shoho's hull with tremendous force. The ship shuddered with each impact, the internal explosions carrying far more violence than the bombs falling on the flight deck. The Shoho began to list, her stern starting to sink lower into the water, her bow rising at an increasingly steep angle. The captain and his officers understood that the ship was finished. The order went out to abandon ship, and the crew began to pour out of the hatches and over the sides, sailors and airmen jumping into the warm water of the Coral Sea, swimming away from the doomed carrier as fast as they could. The American aircraft made pass after pass, pouring fire into the dying ship even as she slipped beneath the waves. No one was trying to be merciful. This was war, and the Shoho was the enemy. The death of the Shoho lasted only minutes, but seemed to stretch far longer. The little carrier, which had served with distinction in earlier campaigns in the Indian Ocean, which had trained her air crew and gunners to high proficiency, which had believed herself protected by superior Japanese naval power and planning. That ship went under at approximately 11 o'clock in the morning on the 7th of May, 1942. She sank bow first, her stern rising high into the air as she descended, the water closing over her superstructure, and within moments she was gone, taking down with her more than 600 of her crew members. The survivors, hundreds of them, were left in the water, clinging to pieces of wreckage, waiting for rescue that might never come. This was the first Japanese carrier ever sunk by American air power, a distinction that would be recorded and celebrated in the hours that followed. But for the moment, there was only the silence after the roar of engines and guns, and the terrible quiet of men in the water, waiting to die or waiting to live. It was in this moment of aftermath that one of the most famous radio calls of the Pacific War was transmitted. Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon, leading a Yorktown scout bomber squadron, radioed back to his carrier with the news of the sinking. The exact wording of the transmission became the stuff of legend, though different accounts vary slightly in the precise phrasing. The essential message was clear and defiant. The Shoho had gone down, and American air power had done it. The transmission was intercepted, relayed, and eventually made its way back to Pearl Harbor and then to Washington. Here was proof, undeniable, concrete proof, that the American Navy could strike back. Here was a Japanese warship sunk by American pilots, flying from American carriers. The mood on both Yorktown and Lexington must have been electric in the hours after the strike reports came in. The pilots who had launched hours earlier were returning now, some damaged, some with stories of mechanical failures and near misses, but all of them claiming hits. The ship's company, who had lived under constant tension and fear for days, now had something to celebrate. A Japanese carrier had been sent to the bottom of the Coral Sea, and it had been done by American hands. Yet even in this moment of triumph, there was a crucial incompleteness to the achievement. The Shoho was not the real prize. She was a light carrier, useful for fleet operations, and perfectly capable in her role as an escort and air defense platform. But she was not one of the main fleet carriers. The real Japanese striking force, the Shokaku and Zuikaku, the heavy carriers that carried the bulk of the Japanese air power, remained unlocated and intact. They were still out there, beyond the reach of American aircraft, preparing their own strike against the American carriers. The destruction of the Shoho gave American morale a boost and proved that American pilots could accomplish a major sinking. But strategically, the battle was far from decided. Both sides were still searching for each other. Both sides were still preparing their killer blow. The sinking of the Shoho was a local and tactical victory, a vindication of the decision to bring the carriers into the Coral Sea. But it was not the decisive engagement that would determine the outcome of this battle, or the fate of Australia. That was still to come, on the 8th of May, when the two main Japanese fleet carriers would finally come within range of the American striking force, and the two naval forces would engage in the way that history had designed for them, with aircraft at distance, with the opposing ships never seeing each other's guns. The Shoho had been found and destroyed, but she was merely the opening note in a much larger and far more consequential symphony of fire and steel that was about to unfold across the Coral Sea. The day had consumed both fleets entirely. By the time the sun began its descent toward the western horizon on the evening of the 7th of May, 1942, American and Japanese commanders had been operating on incomplete information, tactical improvisation, and the pure adrenaline of engagement for 16 consecutive hours. The light carrier Shoho lay at the bottom of the Coral Sea, a vessel that hours before had carried aircraft and hopes and the lives of hundreds of men. Both the Shokaku and the Yorktown had sustained damage, one crippled and withdrawing, the other still afloat and still capable of fighting, though battered. As darkness fell across the water, the battle seemed to hang suspended, as if the ocean itself needed to rest, yet rest would not come. Instead, the gathering night would give rise to one of the most surreal and terrifying moments of the entire engagement, an accident born from confusion, fear, and the simple human tragedy of mistaken identity in the dark. The Japanese strike force, returning from their attacks on the American carriers, faced an increasingly desperate situation as the sun slipped lower. Many of the aircraft had expended their fuel in the long flight out and the intense combat overhead. The pilots had fought hard, pressing their attacks with the courage and determination that had carried the Japanese military through one conquest after another. But courage and determination could not change fundamental physics. An aircraft that had been airborne since dawn, that had climbed to altitude, dived on targets, twisted and turned through defensive fire, and then flown the long distance home again. Such an aircraft would be running on fumes by the time darkness began to fall. The pilots knew this. They could feel it in the engine vibrations, in the sluggish responsiveness of their control surfaces, in the rising anxiety as every mile home consumed precious remaining fuel. Some crews would not make it back at all. They would ditch in the darkness, hoping to be picked up by a destroyer or left to the mercy of the Pacific. Others would arrive overhead, their own fleet, barely able to maintain altitude. The Japanese fleet itself faced a terrible navigational challenge. The Shokaku, damaged but still steaming, was withdrawing to the north with her escort vessels. The Zuikaku, unscathed by American attacks, was still present and still capable of flight operations. But in the darkness and confusion of a night battle scenario, or more accurately, the aftermath of battle, the fleet's exact position had become uncertain. Radio discipline, essential to preserve operational security, meant that returning pilots could not simply broadcast a request for bearing and distance to their own ships. Searchlights were out of the question. They would announce the fleet's position to any American aircraft still airborne and searching in the dark. The pilots had coordinates, had calculations, had the training that every skilled naval aviator received. But a calculation made at altitude, in darkness, with fuel gauges moving toward the red line, was a terrible foundation for night carrier recovery operations. Japanese night flying techniques, compared to American procedures, were still in their infancy. The Japanese Navy had invested heavily in daylight supremacy. They had assumed that battles would be fought in daylight hours by day-trained pilots. The reality of modern naval warfare was beginning to contradict that assumption. It was in this maelstrom of confusion and desperation that fate played a cruel hand. The Japanese pilots, desperate to find their fleet, desperately seeking any carrier from which they might recover their aircraft and themselves, spotted what appeared to be a carrier through the gathering darkness. They saw the silhouette, saw what they interpreted as the reassuring bulk of a flat top, a flat flight deck, the island structure, the distinctive profile that could only belong to one of their own. What they had actually found was the USS Yorktown. The American carrier, having fought through the day and recovered her own aircraft, was now steaming through the darkness with her combat air patrol overhead and her anti-aircraft crews alert and tense. No one aboard the Yorktown was expecting friendly aircraft to appear out of the night. The battle was ongoing. The enemy was still out there. Every shadow in the darkness could be a Japanese torpedo plane. Every aircraft approaching from an unexpected angle could be enemy. The Japanese pilots, convinced they had found their own fleet, began to enter what they believed was a normal landing pattern. They reduced speed. They lowered their landing gear. They aligned themselves with what they thought was the flight deck of a Japanese carrier. From the deck of the Yorktown, American sailors and gunners watched this approach with rapidly escalating alarm. Aircraft were coming in. Aircraft that did not signal the correct recognition codes. Aircraft that did not match the profile of any American machine. Aircraft that were clearly attempting to land on the American carrier. The identification protocols that every naval vessel maintained began to fail against the simple horror of seeing an apparent enemy approaching from above, descending, making its clear intention to land known through its very posture and approach angle. There was no time for negotiation. There was no time for verification. There was only the immediate, visceral certainty that an enemy was attempting to land on your ship. The American anti-aircraft gunners opened fire. The night sky above the Yorktown suddenly erupted into chaos. Searchlights swept upward. Tracer ammunition arced into the darkness, in lines of orange and red fire. The sound was extraordinary, overwhelming, the kind of noise that filled every space and every moment, and left no room for thought or reaction beyond the immediate animal response to threat. Below, the Japanese pilots, shocked and bewildered by this unexpected violence, suddenly understood the terrible truth. This was not their ship. This was an American carrier. They were under fire. The aircraft that had been peacefully descending toward what they believed was a Japanese flight deck now found themselves the targets of one of the most powerful defensive concentrations in the Pacific Fleet. Some pilots attempted to abort their landings and climb away. Others, low on fuel and disoriented by the sudden onslaught, tried to press through the fire. One Japanese aircraft actually made contact with the Yorktown's flight deck before being destroyed. It seemed almost incomprehensible. A Japanese pilot had actually managed to land on an American carrier, if only for a moment, before the ship's crew realized what had happened, and the aircraft was torn apart by the continuing fire. The scene that unfolded was simultaneously nightmarish and almost farcical. A desperate moment where the fundamental assumptions of naval warfare seemed to invert themselves. The Americans were firing at aircraft that were attempting to land, not to attack. The Japanese pilots, exhausted and terrified, were dying not in combat, but in a confusion of identity. One Japanese aircraft attempted to take off again after touching the Yorktown's deck, only to crash back down moments later. Another Japanese pilot, understanding at last what had happened, attempted to radio his fleet with a warning. The American gunners continued to fire, their voices sharp and urgent over the radio net as they called out targets and tracked the desperately fleeing aircraft. The darkness that had seemed to offer safety and concealment suddenly offered neither. It offered only confusion and death. How many Japanese aircraft actually penetrated to the Yorktown's position that night remains uncertain. Estimates vary, as do the accounts of the men who lived through it. Some records suggest as many as a dozen or more Japanese machines were in the vicinity of the American fleet as darkness fell. Others place the number lower. What is certain is that at least several aircraft made contact with the American formation. At least one, possibly more, actually attempted to land on the Yorktown. The American gunners, operating on pure instinct and the necessity of self-defense, fired at everything that seemed to fit the profile of an enemy machine. They could not afford to be wrong. They could not afford to hesitate. The penalty for either error was the loss of their ship or the loss of their lives. They made their choice, again and again, moment after moment, sending streams of anti-aircraft fire into the darkness. Each burst aimed at a shape or a silhouette or a target that was only half visible in the chaotic intersection of searchlight and shadow. The chaos aboard the Yorktown during those terrible minutes was extreme. The combat air patrol overhead was frantically attempting to maintain formation and identify targets in darkness. The ship herself was maneuvering, turning hard to avoid the attacking aircraft, or what were perceived as attacking aircraft. The crews below decks heard the thunder of the anti-aircraft guns above their heads, felt the ship shudder with recoil and impact, and attempted to understand what was happening through the fog of commands and warnings crackling over the radio net. Below in damage control stations and engineering compartments, American sailors worked knowing only that they were under attack, not knowing the nature of that attack or when it might end. The bridge of the ship, from which all decisions flowed, operated on fragmentary information and the necessity of making split-second judgments that could mean the difference between survival and catastrophic loss. The commanding officers of the Yorktown made their decisions and lived with the consequences. The anti-aircraft gunners made their targeting decisions in milliseconds. The pilots of the combat air patrol attempted to locate enemies in darkness that was nearly total. And throughout it all, the Japanese aircraft continued to come, attempting to land or attempting to escape or attempting to understand what had happened. When the engagement finally ended, and such things do eventually end, when all the targets have either escaped or been destroyed, when all the ammunition has either connected or been expended into empty sky, the Yorktown was still afloat. She had taken damage from the anti-aircraft fire of her own ships as much as from any enemy weapon, but she remained seaworthy, remained able to steam, remained able to recover her own aircraft. The radar operators and lookouts and gunners had successfully defended against an attack that had never truly been an attack at all. The human cost to the Japanese pilots was severe. Those aircraft that had managed to escape the Yorktown's fire still faced the overwhelming problem that had launched this confused episode in the first place. They were desperately low on fuel, flying in darkness, with no certainty of where their own fleet might be. Some of those aircraft would ditch in the water that night. Some would be recovered by Japanese destroyers or cruisers. Some would simply disappear into the darkness, never to be found. The human cost of an error, multiplied across several aircraft and dozens of lives, was steep. What this extraordinary incident revealed, above all else, was the absolute disorientation that had gripped both sides. The Japanese had lost track of the American fleet's position with such completeness that they had flown toward a ship they believed to be their own. The Americans had become so attuned to the expectation of attack that they had opened fire on aircraft that, under any other circumstance, might have been recognized as confused rather than hostile. Both sides were operating at the very edge of what their systems and their training could handle. The communications failures, the navigation uncertainties, the darkness itself, and the simple human tendency to see what one expects to see, rather than what is actually there. All of these factors had combined to create a moment that seemed to belong more to darkly comic opera than to serious military operations. Yet the consequences were entirely serious. Men died. Machines were destroyed. The incident lasted only minutes, but it carried weight far beyond its duration. In the hours that followed, as darkness deepened and both fleets withdrew into their respective positions, the full implications of the day began to become clear, though not yet fully visible to the commanders, who were still in the midst of processing what had happened. The Shokaku was damaged and withdrawing. The Zuikaku's air group had sustained losses and was dispersed across a vast area of ocean. The Yorktown remained in the fight, though battered. The Lexington was not yet dead. That final tragedy still lay a few hours in the future. But already, as the night deepened, and the exhausted sailors and airmen of both nations attempted to rest and recover, the fundamental calculus of the battle was beginning to shift. What had seemed like a clear Japanese victory in the first hours after the strikes was becoming something far more complex, far more uncertain. The night had brought confusion and error, and the near-farcical moment of Japanese aircraft attempting to land on an American carrier. But the night had also brought a kind of reckoning, a moment when the accumulated exhaustion and disorientation of the day made itself felt in the most vivid and terrible way possible. The Battle of the Coral Sea was far from over, but this strange night, with its accidents and its alarms, and its fundamental confusion about who was where and what was happening, had underscored a truth that both commanders would need to reckon with in the hours ahead. Naval warfare had transformed utterly. The ships themselves had become almost secondary to the aircraft that operated from them. Victory and defeat were no longer measured in the immediate aftermath of engagement, but in the capacity to sustain operations, to recover crews, to maintain command and control, even in the face of darkness and confusion, and the fundamental fog of war that separated intention from outcome, from the moment an order was given to the moment its consequences became visible to those who had given it. The 8th of May, 1942, broke across the Coral Sea as another grey morning of scattered clouds and uncertain visibility. Neither fleet commander knew for certain where the other lay. The search had consumed the previous 2 days with contradictory reports, false sightings, and the paralyzing uncertainty that comes when millions of tons of steel and thousands of lives depend on finding a target across an ocean the size of a continent. But on this morning, almost by accident, almost by the grinding inevitability of two forces closing toward each other across open water, the searching would finally end. What neither Admiral Chester Nimitz in Pearl Harbor nor Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto in Tokyo could have orchestrated with precision was about to unfold with the terrible logic of geometry. Two carrier forces, separated by roughly 200 kilometers, both launching their aircraft within minutes of each other, both unaware that the other had already begun to move. By the time the sun climbed higher over the Coral Sea, history would record the first naval battle ever fought, where the opposing ships would never see each other, where the real combat would play out thousands of meters above the water, in the sky itself. The morning search had begun before dawn. Aboard USS Yorktown, under the command of Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, pilots and aircrew had been roused from their bunks in the pre-dawn darkness. The routine was by now familiar. The grind of boots on metal decks, the smell of coffee and metal, the ritualistic arming of aircraft, the checking and rechecking of weapons, compasses, and fuel gauges. Dive bombers and torpedo planes were wheeled into position on the flight deck. The Enterprise and Hornet, sister carriers under Admiral Nimitz's direct command, were also launching their search teams. Reconnaissance planes, each carrying an observer with a radio and trained eyes, climbed into the murky sky to sweep the ocean in vast arcs. The pilots knew what they were looking for: the distinctive silhouettes of Japanese carriers, the gleam of sunlight on flight decks, the telltale wakes of a task force moving through open water. The range was enormous, visibility poor, and the ocean itself seemed to conspire to keep the two fleets hidden from each other. Then, just after 8 in the morning, the first radio call crackled back to the American carriers. Enemy ships sighted. Not a vague report or a tentative identification, but a genuine sighting, a position, a bearing. Japanese carriers had been found. On the other side of the horizon, almost simultaneously, Japanese search aircraft were reporting exactly the same discovery in reverse. The American task force had been located. Vice Admiral Takagi, commanding the Japanese carrier striking force from his flagship, had received the report he had been waiting for. The moment of decision had arrived. The Americans were out there somewhere beyond the clouds and rain squalls, and the question was no longer whether the two fleets would find each other, but what would happen when they did. Both commanders reached the same conclusion within minutes of each other: launch everything. Every dive bomber, every torpedo plane, every fighter that could be armed and fueled would be sent aloft. The flight decks of Shokaku and Zuikaku, the two great Japanese fleet carriers, erupted into controlled chaos. Aircraft handlers ran across the deck with signal flags and hand signals. Pilots climbed into their cockpits, strapped themselves in, and ran through their pre-flight checks with the mechanical precision that comes from endless repetition. Engines coughed to life, sending plumes of exhaust across the flight decks. The massive catapults that would hurl these machines into the air were armed and prepared. One by one, with a roar that shook the deck and seemed to shake the very air, the aircraft began to launch. Aboard Yorktown and Lexington, the order to launch had already gone down to the flight deck crews. The same frenzy of activity unfolded on the American side, but with a difference. The American carriers would launch their strike in several waves, not all at once. The first wave, launched just after 8 o'clock in the morning, consisted of the most modern American aircraft available. Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, fast and accurate, each carrying a single 500-pound bomb, and the skill of pilots who had trained endlessly for this moment. Grumman TBF, Avenger torpedo bombers, newer and more formidable than the older devastators they would accompany, each carrying a heavy aerial torpedo that could rip open a carrier's hull if it found its mark. And Wildcats, the fighters that would attempt to shield the strike aircraft from Japanese interceptors and combat air patrol. The noise was extraordinary, the vibration through the ship's structure almost unbearable. On the bridge, Fletcher and his staff watched as the aircraft lifted off into the grey morning sky, climbing into formation and heading west toward the reported position of the enemy. They had sent somewhere near 60 aircraft aloft in that first wave. No one yet knew that the Japanese had already done exactly the same thing from the opposite direction. What was about to happen in the sky above the Coral Sea had never happened before in the history of naval warfare. 2 strike packages, totaling more than 150 aircraft, were now in the air, flying toward each other across the open ocean. The Japanese pilots did not know the Americans had launched. The American pilots did not know the Japanese were already airborne. On the radar screens and in the plotting rooms of both carriers, the men watching the scope displays were tracking blips that represented aircraft, but they had no way of knowing whose aircraft was whose until the radio operators heard the voices and accents of the pilots communicating with their own ships. The sky became increasingly crowded with machines and men hurtling through space at 400 kilometers per hour or more. The sun climbed higher, burning off some of the clouds, and visibility improved. Below them, the ocean remained vast and empty and indifferent to the drama unfolding above it. The pilots searched the sky ahead of them, trying to spot the enemy first, knowing that whoever saw whom first would have an advantage, however slim. It was not the kind of advantage that mattered much in the long run, but pilots who had trained for months for this moment were acutely aware of every factor that might increase their chances of survival and mission success. The first hostile contact came not from the strike packages crossing in mid-air, but from the Japanese combat air patrol already aloft from their carriers. Japanese Zeros, the fast and nimble fighters that had dominated the skies over the Pacific for the past 5 months, spotted the incoming American formation and moved to intercept. The first shots were fired at an altitude of roughly 4,000 meters, with American pilots suddenly aware that the sky ahead of them was no longer empty. The Japanese fighters attacked from above and behind, the traditional position of advantage, and the American formation began to scatter as pilots performed evasive maneuvers. Some American fighters, the Wildcats, turned to meet the Japanese attack. Others, the bombers, tried to maintain their course and altitude, trusting that the fighters would shield them from the worst of the Japanese assault. The radio chatter became increasingly urgent and confused, with pilots calling out positions and threats in voices that betrayed excitement and fear, and the strange clinical detachment that comes from focusing entirely on the mechanics of survival and killing. The first American aircraft began to fall from the sky, tracer fire cutting through the morning air, wreckage tumbling earthward toward the sea far below. But even as the Japanese fighters engaged the American strike package, the Japanese strike aircraft themselves were approaching the American task force from a different direction. The two fleets, never losing sight of their objective, continued to move toward each other. Aboard the American carriers, radar operators watched as the Japanese formation appeared on their screens, closing the range with each passing minute. They called down to the flight decks and up to the bridges. Hostile aircraft approaching, multiple contacts, distance closing rapidly. The American Combat Air Patrol, already committed to fighting Japanese bombers coming in from one direction, now had to contend with the realization that additional threats were approaching from angles that would be difficult to defend. The choreography of a modern carrier battle unfolded with the complexity of a dance in which both sides were trying to kill each other while moving to music only they could hear. Yorktown and Lexington, knowing that aircraft were inbound, began to maneuver, executing tight turns and radical changes of course designed to avoid the bombs and torpedoes that would soon be falling and racing through the water toward them. The crew members not directly involved in combat stood or huddled in compartments deep within the ships, waiting, listening to the sounds of combat echoing through the hull, unable to do anything but wait and hope that their ship and their shipmates would survive the next few minutes. The American strike aircraft, having fought through the Japanese combat air patrol and suffered casualties in the process, finally laid eyes on their target. Below them, through breaks in the cloud cover, they could see the Japanese carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, steaming across the sea in formation, with their supporting cruisers and destroyers. The moment of attack had arrived. The dive bombers went into their steep dives, angling toward the Japanese ships with the sun behind them, making it difficult for the anti-aircraft gunners below to see them until they were already committed to their runs. The whine of the dive grew louder as the aircraft descended, accelerating past their normal operating speeds. The pilots' eyes fixed on the target, their hands steady on the control yokes. Behind them, the torpedo bombers came in low, just above the surface of the sea, flying through barrages of anti-aircraft fire, trying to get close enough to launch their weapons before the Japanese guns knocked them from the sky. In the few seconds between the launch of their torpedoes and the moment they turned away from the target, these pilots knew they were most vulnerable. They flew straight and level, unable to maneuver, unable to defend themselves, hoping only that their sacrifice would result in a hit and that enough of them would survive to return to their carriers and land safely. The Japanese bombers and torpedo planes, meanwhile, were doing exactly the same thing to the American carriers. They had located Yorktown and Lexington through the clouds and rain squalls, and they were pressing home their attack with the discipline and determination that had served the Japanese air forces so well across the previous months of conquest. The anti-aircraft guns on the American carriers opened fire, creating arcs of tracers that looked beautiful and terrible in the grey morning light. The noise was overwhelming, a thunder that seemed to come from every direction at once. The ships maneuvered violently, captains and helmsmen doing everything they could to avoid the incoming fire, knowing that one mistake, one misjudgment of timing, 1 second too slow on the helm, could mean the difference between a near miss and a direct hit. The pilots pressing home the attack on the American carriers were not thinking about survival at this moment. They were thinking about the target, about getting close enough to make their weapons count, about completing their mission. Some of them would not make it back to their ships. They knew this, and they came in anyway. In the space of a few terrible minutes, the entire calculus of the battle was written out in the language of ordnance and fire. American pilots aimed at Japanese ships, and Japanese pilots aimed at American ships, and the ocean between them erupted with the sounds and sights of modern naval warfare. Aircraft fell from the sky, trailing smoke and flames. Ships maneuvered frantically, their hulls shuddering from the near misses of bombs and the eruptions of the sea around them. The anti-aircraft fire continued without pause, a constant barrage from thousands of guns, each one adding to the chaos and the noise and the sense that the world had come unmoored from all normal rules and laws. And above it all, in the sky above the Coral Sea, was the strange silence of the pilots who had survived this far, who were turning their aircraft away from the targets they had just attacked, who were looking to see which of their friends had made it through, and who were now beginning the journey back to their carriers, back to the possibility of safety, back to the decks where other pilots were already climbing into the cockpits of reserve aircraft, ready to launch if ordered, ready to continue the fight if the battle was not yet decided. The two strike packages had crossed paths in the sky above the Coral Sea, and the first time in naval history when opposing carriers would strike each other had come and gone in the space of a few minutes. Neither side had gained an overwhelming advantage. Both sides had suffered losses. Both sides had scored hits. The question now was what would happen next, what the damage would reveal when the smoke cleared, and whether the battle was truly decided, or whether it would continue into the afternoon and the following days. The pilots who had survived returned to their ships, landing on the flight decks with the careful precision born from exhaustion and the knowledge that they had just lived through something that would shape not only their own lives, but the lives of millions of people they would never meet. Behind them, in the sky and across the ocean, the Japanese pilots were returning to Shokaku and Zuikaku, carrying with them reports of American ships hit and damaged. The two fleets had finally found each other, and the collision had been as violent and as consequential as anyone on either side had feared. The Japanese strike aircraft were already in the air before the American planes began their own climb toward the enemy fleet. Wave after wave of bombers and torpedo planes had lifted from the decks of Shokaku and Zuikaku, assembling into disciplined formations as they pushed eastward through the scattered clouds and rain squalls of the Coral Sea. The pilots knew their target was somewhere ahead, the American carriers that intelligence had placed in their path. What they did not know, and what no one in either fleet could know with certainty, was that at that very moment, the American aircraft were flying toward them, crossing the same empty sky from the opposite direction. Both forces were committed now, both inbound, both searching through broken cloud and wind-torn visibility for an enemy they had yet to glimpse. The morning of the 8th of May, 1942, had become a race toward collision, invisible and terrible and irreversible. The American task force under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher had received the signal just before dawn. Search aircraft, casting their nets across the horizon, had finally located the Japanese carriers. The bearing was north, the distance still considerable, but close enough that Fletcher ordered the attack immediately. Yorktown and Lexington began launching their strike packages simultaneously, sending up every available dive bomber and torpedo plane and their fighter escorts, until the decks of both ships were empty and the aircraft were climbing into the pale morning light. The men on the flight decks watched them go with the complicated mixture of professional detachment and profound anxiety that defined carrier warfare. There was nothing more to be done now. The outcome of the battle rested with young men in fragile machines, climbing into the unknown, and with whatever was about to rain down upon the ships they had just abandoned. The Japanese strike found the American carriers first. Lookouts aboard Lexington, scanning the broken clouds above, suddenly shouted warnings as aircraft materialized through the haze. Japanese fighters first, then the bombers descending toward attack position, diving down in the carefully choreographed geometry of a coordinated strike. The formation was beautiful and deadly, the product of months of training and the accumulated experience of pilots who had spent the past 6 months unopposed across the Pacific. Below, the ships turned hard, their gunners swinging weapons toward the incoming threat, but there was no time for organized defense. The Japanese came in 2 waves almost simultaneously, torpedo bombers approaching from one direction while dive bombers plummeted from above, and the Americans found themselves bracketed and pinned by converging angles of attack. Lexington took the first torpedo hit amidships, the explosion erupting along her starboard side and sending a column of water and smoke climbing skyward. The ship shuddered violently, and alarms began wailing through every compartment as damage control parties sprang into action. The crew had been trained for this, drilled and conditioned to respond to catastrophe with efficient, mechanical precision. Sailors who had been eating breakfast minutes before found themselves wearing gas masks and moving through smoke-filled passageways, hauling hoses and shoring up bulkheads against spreading water. A second torpedo struck almost immediately, hitting further forward, and the great ship began to list noticeably to starboard. The explosions that followed belonged to the dive bombers, bombs punching through the flight deck and detonating in the compartments below, sending up smaller but no less violent concussions that rattled the entire structure of the ship. Fires broke out immediately, orange flames licking up from the flight deck, spreading across the wooden surface where aircraft had been launching toward the enemy only moments before. Yorktown, nearby, was also under attack, and she was taking her own punishment. Torpedo planes came in low, their engines roaring as they pressed home their attack runs, despite the ferocious anti-aircraft fire from every gun on the ship. At least one torpedo found its mark, striking the carrier forward of the island, and the shock of the explosion threw men to the deck across half the ship. Dive bombers screamed down through the clouds, bombs detonating on the flight deck and in the hangar spaces below. The American gunners were returning fire with everything they had, the staccato roar of machine guns, the heavier thuds of the 5-inch batteries. But the Japanese pilots were committed and experienced, and there was no breaking their formations. A bomb landed near the island structure, killing several officers and men on the flag bridge. But Admiral Fletcher and his staff survived, already assessing the damage and continuing to direct the battle even as their ship reeled under the assault. The Japanese aircraft wheeled away after their attack runs were complete, heading back toward their own fleet, their work momentarily done. The scene left behind was one of smoke and confusion and organized chaos. Aboard Lexington, the crew fought with desperate energy to contain the spreading fires. The flight deck was ablaze in multiple locations, but the damage control parties had access to the ship's sophisticated fire suppression systems, miles of piping and foam equipment installed below decks, specifically for this purpose. Compartments were isolated with deliberate flooding to contain the damage. The ventilation systems were shut down to starve the fires of oxygen, and teams worked methodically through the spreading smoke to maintain stability and control. The ship's list was corrected by shifting fuel oil and water ballast, bringing her back toward an even keel. Reports coming up from the damage control center were hopeful. The structural integrity was holding. The fires were being contained. The great ship had taken a beating, but she was still afloat, still operational, still capable of continuing the fight. Yorktown, meanwhile, was bleeding fuel oil from her torpedo wound, but the damage there seemed less severe than feared. The explosion had torn a large hole in her side, flooding several compartments, but the initial panic gave way to something almost like cautious optimism. Her damage control teams worked with the same disciplined urgency as their counterparts aboard Lexington, and preliminary reports suggested that with luck and skill and discipline, she too might survive the battle. The destroyers that had escorted both carriers moved in closer now, their smaller guns adding to the anti-aircraft defenses, their crews alert for the return of Japanese aircraft. The medical parties worked furiously in the sick bays and makeshift treatment areas, tending to the wounded and burned, doing what they could with the tools and supplies available. Men who had been alive and uninjured minutes before were dying or would carry the scars of this morning for the rest of their lives, and there was nothing to be done but to accept this hard fact and continue working. What no one aboard Lexington could see, what no damage report could yet reveal, was the catastrophe taking shape deep within the ship, in the spaces below the waterline, where the fuel tanks and aviation fuel stores fed the ship's engines and aircraft. The torpedo impacts had not breached these spaces directly, and that seemed to be a mercy. But the explosions topside, the violent detonations of bombs landing on and below the flight deck, had damaged the ventilation systems that normally kept the air in these spaces circulating and safe. Aviation fuel, gasoline with a vapor pressure far higher than diesel oil, had begun to vaporize in compartments that were no longer being properly ventilated. The ship's officers, assessing the visible damage from above, could not know that they were sitting atop a vast accumulation of explosive vapor, waiting only for an ignition source. The damage reports continued to sound optimistic because the visible fires were being mastered, the flooding was being controlled, and the ship's structural integrity was holding. No one could see the invisible danger gathering in the dark spaces below, and by the time anyone would understand what was happening, it would be far too late to do anything about it. The American strike aircraft, meanwhile, were locating the Japanese fleet. The Japanese carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, were somewhere in the morning haze to the north, and the American pilots pressed toward them, their aircraft heavy with bombs and torpedoes, their training and their orders driving them forward into the teeth of Japanese fighter opposition. The sky above the Japanese carriers became a maelstrom of combat. American Wildcat fighters mixing with Japanese Zeros, dive bombers dodging through flak, torpedo planes boring in low toward their targets. Shokaku took several bomb hits, her flight deck erupting in flames, smoke pouring from her hull as fires spread through her compartments. The Japanese carrier was damaged seriously, perhaps too damaged to continue flight operations, and the American pilots wheeled away from her, satisfied that they had at least hurt the enemy as badly as they themselves had been hurt. Back aboard Lexington, the afternoon wore on, and the initial reports of near escape began to shift subtly. The visible fires had been extinguished or were under control, but something was wrong. There was a smell in the air below decks, an acrid chemical smell that experienced naval officers recognized with a sinking sensation in their stomachs. Aviation fuel vapor, somewhere in the depths of the ship, in compartments that were supposed to be safe. The vapors were accumulating. At 1350 hours, nearly 5 hours after the initial torpedo and bomb impacts, a spark or a static discharge or some other ignition source found those vapors, and the consequences were catastrophic. An explosion erupted deep in the ship, not a single devastating blast, but a series of them, propagating through the interior spaces as the accumulated fuel vapor ignited in compartment after compartment. The ship heaved and twisted, and suddenly, the calm professionalism of the damage control parties gave way to the realization that something fundamental had changed. The explosions were coming from the inside now, from places where the crew could not reach them, and there was no way to fight an enemy that was already inside your own ship. The order was given to abandon ship. The crew, who had fought so hard and so skillfully to save their vessel, who had believed for hours that they might actually succeed, now had to accept that Lexington was lost. The evacuation began in good order, organized and controlled, with men moving to their muster stations and boarding the destroyers that had moved alongside to receive them. There was no panic, no chaos, no desperate scrambling for the lifeboats. Instead, there was a kind of grim resignation, a collective acknowledgement that they had done everything that could be done, and that it had not been enough. Officers made their way below for final checks, ensuring that no one had been left behind in the smoke and darkness, and then they too made their way topside and across the lines to the rescue ships. Nearly the entire crew of more than 2,000 men was saved, a testament to the discipline and training of the American Navy, a small mercy in what was becoming an increasingly bitter morning. The stricken carrier burned throughout the afternoon, a great pyre of smoke and flames, marking her death throes across miles of empty ocean. The fires raged unchecked through her compartments, consuming the ship from within, and it became clear that Lexington was beyond saving. She had to be sunk, destroyed deliberately, to prevent any possibility that the Japanese might capture or salvage her. The destroyer USS Phelps, one of her own escort ships, moved alongside and delivered the final mercy, a spread of torpedoes that sent the great carrier beneath the waves. She sank at 1752 hours, slipping beneath the surface of the Coral Sea, with the dignity that such a vessel deserved. Her crew watching from the rescue ships, with eyes that registered loss and sorrow, and the strange bond that men develop with a ship they have called home. The largest ship sunk so far in the Pacific War, gone in an afternoon, her sacrifice seemingly confirming what the losses of tonnage suggested, that this battle had been a Japanese victory. While the Japanese strike package hurtled toward the American carriers through the broken cloud of the Coral Sea, the American flyers were themselves already airborne, climbing into a sky that would soon become a cauldron of fire and metal and dying men. The crews of USS Lexington and USS Yorktown had launched their strikes in the pre-dawn darkness, launching a combined force of dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters into the void, each pilot knowing only the general direction and approximate position of the enemy fleet. There was no precision here, no certainty, The American pilots flew into the unknown with maps and mathematics, and the hope that their intelligence was accurate, that their search would not be in vain, that somewhere ahead, through the haze and cloud, lay the targets their commanders had promised them. The distance separating the two strike packages stretched across many dozens of kilometers of open Pacific. Above the Coral Sea, two fleets hurled their young men toward each other like blind boxers trading blows, never knowing when the blow would land or from where the counterattack would come. This was the terrible geometry of carrier warfare in its infancy, a dance of death choreographed by men who had never done this before and were learning the steps in real time, with lives hanging on every decision. The American torpedo bombers, the slow Douglas TBD devastators, climbed laboriously into the humid air, their crews watching the altimeter tick upward with the grinding patience of mechanics hauling weight. These aircraft were obsolete almost before they flew, designed for an older war and carrying a torpedo whose reliability was questionable at best, whose settings were unpredictable, whose very mechanics were a mystery to half the men who carried them. The dive bombers, the Douglas SBD Dauntless aircraft, climbed faster and higher, built for precision, built for the near-vertical plunge toward a target, built to deliver their bombs with an accuracy that the torpedo bombers could only dream about. The fighters, too few Wildcat aircraft to provide adequate cover, weaved and circled above the strike force, watching the sky for the enemy fighters that might come seeking them. The American flyers had practiced for this moment, trained for months in the routine of finding an enemy fleet and attacking it, yet nothing in training quite captured the reality of the vast emptiness of the Pacific, the way the horizon seemed to stretch forever in every direction, the way a fleet of ships could seem to vanish entirely into the texture of wind and wave and weather. The search was frantic, disciplined, and utterly dependent on luck and mathematics and the quality of the intelligence that had sent them this way in the first place. In the hours before the strike, the search aircraft had radioed back fragmentary sightings, partial confirmations, positions that shifted and changed with each updated report. The pilots of the strike force had to make their calculations without knowing for certain where the enemy was, flying on headings that would position them to search, to fan out across the sky and hope that someone would see the smoke and the hulls and the wake of a Japanese carrier. The intelligence that had been so precious in the codebreaker's hut, the carefully reconstructed piece of the Japanese plan, had to translate now into navigation, into fuel calculations, into the desperate hunt across an empty sea. The American strike aircraft climbed to altitude, formed their formation, and turned toward the coordinates they had been given, carrying the hopes of the American Navy and the weight of a decision made by men in the operations room aboard Lexington and the flag bridge of Yorktown. The lead pilots, the flight leaders, and the bombardiers, and the torpedo plane pilots, designated as strike leaders, carried with them the responsibility of finding the target and getting their men home again. Some would not be going home. Some of them were already dead, though they did not know it yet, and would keep flying toward the Coral Sea for another hour, another 30 minutes, another few minutes before the enemy found them, or they found the enemy, or both happenings occurred simultaneously in a collision of machines and men. The Japanese carrier force, meanwhile, had scrambled its own strike aircraft, and the two formations passed each other in the air without seeing, two clouds of machines and men crossing paths in the vastness of the Pacific. The American pilots did not know they were being attacked while they flew toward their target. They did not know that behind them, descending toward their own ships, were the bombers and the torpedo planes and the fighters of the Imperial Japanese Navy, death on wings, coming fast and coming hard. The Japanese strike aircraft had the advantage of being guided by the Japanese fleet itself, guided in by radio direction finding, guided in by the plots that the Japanese commanders were maintaining, guided toward the American carriers with a precision that the Japanese flyers envied and that the American flyers, so far from their own fleet, could only dream about. The American strike leaders had only their charts and their compasses and their dead reckoning, and the sky was vast and full of trick horizons and false clouds and the texture of weather that made everything uncertain. But they were determined, and they were trained, and they were Americans flying toward combat. And somewhere in that combination lay the seeds of both triumph and tragedy, of glory and of loss. The first sighting came from one of the American search aircraft, a reconnaissance plane that had been flying the perimeter of the search pattern, a pilot whose eyes were straining against the glare and the cloud cover, looking for any sign of a hostile fleet. When the report came in, the coordinates snapped the strike force into focus. The Japanese fleet was there. The Japanese carriers were positioned somewhere in that section of the ocean, and the American pilots banked their aircraft, formed their formations tighter, and pushed toward the reported position with something approaching certainty. The noise in the cockpits intensified as pilots checked their weapons, as bombardiers peered through their bomb sights, as torpedo plane pilots confirmed that their weapons were armed and ready, and as everyone, from the flight leaders down to the youngest ensign in the back seat, understood that the moment of attack was approaching. The Coral Sea, for all its vastness, was suddenly a very small place. Two groups of men were converging on the same spot, and only one group was going to succeed in what they had come to do. The Japanese fleet, under Vice Admiral Takagi, had positioned the two fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku in a formation designed to concentrate their anti-aircraft firepower while maintaining the ability to maneuver. Cruisers and destroyers formed a screen, their guns ready, their officers watching the sky. The carriers themselves were already launching additional combat air patrol fighters, trying to achieve a level of defense that seemed perpetually insufficient. The Japanese pilots were experienced, many of them veterans of earlier battles and of the long campaigns across China, but the morning of the 8th of May found them suddenly operating under conditions they had not anticipated, with American aircraft already approaching their position. The Japanese radar, such as it was, had given them some warning, but radar in 1942 was still a miraculous and unreliable instrument, and the human eye was still the most trusted detector of an incoming threat. The lookouts on the Japanese carriers stood at their posts, straining to see through the scattered clouds, searching for the shape of American aircraft against the sky. When the American strike aircraft finally broke through the clouds and saw the Japanese carriers, the American pilots experienced a surge of elation and terror in the same instant. There were the targets, the great flat-topped ships that were the whole purpose of their mission, the reason they had flown through the uncertain sky, and the reason they were about to put themselves in the most dangerous place in the world. The dive bombers of the American force angled their aircraft, began their climbs to the altitude they needed for their attacks. The torpedo bombers, slower and more vulnerable, began searching for the best approach angle, the best distance and bearing from which to deliver their weapons. The American fighters wove above and around the formation, watching for Japanese fighters that seemed to be appearing from every direction. Japanese interceptors, whose pilots were equally desperate to stop the American strike before it could land its blows. The flak began almost immediately, the anti-aircraft fire from the Japanese ships rising in black puffs and orange flashes, a wall of metal and explosive force that seemed designed to shred anything that came near it. The American pilots pressed through it anyway, because that was what they had been trained to do. because that was what the war demanded, and because there was no turning back now. The dive bombers pushed over into their attacks, the world rotating beneath them as they pointed their noses downward and opened their throttles, converting altitude into speed, converting the mathematics of ballistics into the reality of a bomb falling toward a target. The dauntless dive bombers of the American Navy had a reputation for accuracy, and the pilots pushing their aircraft toward Shokaku were intent on living up to that reputation. The Japanese carrier became larger and larger in their gun sights as they descended, the flatness of her deck becoming visible, the superstructure taking shape, the anti-aircraft guns seeming to fire directly at the aircraft coming at them. Several bombs found their target. The deck of Shokaku erupted in flame and smoke as American ordnance struck home, the heavy bombs creating craters of fire and destruction, setting off explosions among the aircraft parked on the flight deck, igniting fuel and ammunition in a cascade of violence that seemed to consume the ship in moments. Damage control parties rushed to their stations. Firefighters fought to contain the blazes, and the ship herself, even as the bombs were still falling, began to slow and list as the weight of damage settled upon her hull. The American dive bombers, having delivered their blows, pushed through the anti-aircraft fire and climbed back toward altitude. Some of them damaged, some of them trailing smoke, but most of them still flying, still intact, still heading back toward their own carriers. The torpedo bombers, meanwhile, had found the Japanese fleet and were attempting their own attacks. But the torpedo bombers of 1942 were instruments of failure waiting to happen. The Douglas TBD Devastators were slow, they were vulnerable, and they had to approach the target from a particular angle and distance in order to successfully deliver their torpedoes. The Japanese carriers were maneuvering, turning, altering their course and speed in an attempt to avoid the incoming weapons. The torpedo bombers, flying low, almost skimming the surface of the water, had to time their releases perfectly and approach from angles that were often impossible to achieve against a moving target. One after another, the American torpedo bombers launched their weapons, the torpedoes splashing into the water and running toward their targets, but more often than not missing, the Japanese ships slipping away, changing course, avoiding the slow machines of death that were trying so hard to find them. The mechanical failures that plagued the American torpedo were adding to the disaster. Torpedoes that ran in circles, torpedoes that sank before reaching their targets, torpedoes whose gyroscopes were unreliable or whose depth settings were wrong. The American torpedo bombers, in the end, failed to score any hits on the Japanese carriers, and their sacrifice, flying into the teeth of the Japanese anti-aircraft fire, going down in flames, was a sacrifice that netted nothing. They had done everything they were trained to do, approached with courage and discipline and determination, and the enemy had simply moved. The weapons had simply failed, and the cost had been paid in American lives, with nothing received in return. But the damage from the dive bombers was sufficient to cripple Shokaku. The Japanese carrier, her flight deck wrecked, her aircraft destroyed or unable to launch, her hull damaged and taking water, was no longer capable of conducting flight operations. She would have to break off from the battle, detach from the fighting fleet, and turn toward home for repairs that would take many weeks. The loss of Shokaku meant that the Japanese had lost the capacity to bring full air power to bear on the American fleet. The other Japanese carrier, Zuikaku, was still operational, still in the fight, but one fleet carrier was gone from the Japanese order of battle, and in the calculus of carrier warfare, this was a significant development. The American pilots who had attacked Shokaku knew they had damaged her, knew from the smoke and the explosions and the evidence of their own senses that they had hurt the enemy, but they could not know the full meaning of what they had accomplished. They could not know that this damage would echo forward in time, that the absence of these two carriers from the coming battles would matter far more than anyone could have predicted, that the crippling of Shokaku would ripple through the strategy of the war like a stone dropped into still water. The American strike aircraft that had survived the Japanese anti-aircraft fire and the Japanese fighters began the long flight back toward their own carriers. Some were damaged, trailing smoke, their crews uncertain whether they would make it home. Some had crew members wounded, bleeding in the back seats or the turrets, watching the sky and the water below, and hoping that they would survive long enough to reach the friendly decks of Lexington or Yorktown. The pilots, as they flew back across the Coral Sea, knew that they had struck a blow, that they had damaged an enemy carrier, that they had achieved something in the sky over this empty section of ocean. But they also knew that they had failed to sink any enemy carriers outright, that the torpedo bombers had come home empty, that the costs in aircraft and men seemed high relative to the results achieved. This was the bitter arithmetic of 1942 carrier warfare, where American ambition was still far outpacing American capability, where the courage of the pilots was not enough to overcome the mechanical failures of their weapons, where the gap between what the American Navy wanted to accomplish and what it was actually capable of accomplishing was still measured in lives and in losses. The American strike, for all its fury and determination, had not been the decisive blow that might have changed the battle entirely. The Japanese carriers were still afloat, still in the fight, and the second phase of the battle had only just begun. The morning of the 8th of May, 1942, had brought catastrophe to USS Lexington, but not the catastrophe the ship's crew could see. At 0:11 hours, the Japanese strike aircraft had swept over the American carriers with bombs and torpedoes. The great ship, affectionately known as the Lady Lex, had been caught in their crosshairs. 2 aerial torpedoes had struck her port side in quick succession, their detonations tearing through the hull below the waterline. A bomb had found her flight deck, punching through and igniting fires in the spaces below. The concussions had rolled through the ship like the wrath of the sea itself, throwing men from their feet, collapsing light fixtures, and filling compartments with oily black smoke. But the Lexington's damage control parties had responded with practiced discipline. Compartments were sealed. Fires were fought with hose and foam. The list was checked. By all the measures that officers could see and measure, the ship was damaged but not doomed. The captain, Frederick Sherman, moved through the ship with steady authority, issuing orders, checking on his men, radiating a confidence that was only partially founded on reality. The crew had no way of knowing that beneath their feet, in the depths of the ship's machinery spaces, something far more dangerous than any bomb was gathering. The Lexington's vulnerability lay not in what the Japanese had directly inflicted, but in what those direct hits had set in motion below decks. The torpedo strikes had ruptured the avgas system, the network of pipes and tanks that carried high-octane aviation gasoline throughout the ship to service the carrier's aircraft. Gasoline is not merely flammable, it is explosive in its vapors. The volatile fumes from ruptured fuel lines and damaged tanks had begun seeping into the ship's ventilation systems, spreading through compartments and passageways, accumulating in hidden spaces where no eye could see them and no repair party could quickly reach. The Lexington's machinery spaces had already been damaged by the initial explosions, and her ventilation systems were compromised. Fresh air could not flow where it was needed, and the poisonous fog of aviation fuel vapor continued to build in the depths of the ship, hour after hour, invisible and patient. The men working in the lower compartments had reported the smell of gasoline, an acrid warning that something was wrong, but with so much damage to assess and so many urgent repairs to execute, the full extent of the danger remained unrecognized. The ship was being slowly filled with an explosive gas that would eventually find an ignition source, and when it did, the Lexington would not be fighting fires from above, but catastrophe from within. For hours, the damage control efforts seemed to be succeeding. The fires that had been burning openly in the flight deck region and in the hangar deck had been extinguished or brought under control. Firefighting crews worked through smoke and heat, connecting hoses, directing streams of seawater and foam at the flames, rescuing trapped sailors from burning compartments. The initial reports from Captain Sherman had been cautiously optimistic. The ship's engines, though damaged, were still producing power. Damage control parties had successfully isolated flooding and shored up bulkheads. By midday, the Lexington seemed to have done the impossible, survived a direct assault from Japanese carrier aircraft, and remained afloat and in fighting condition. The mood aboard the ship, though tense, had shifted from panic to grim determination. Sailors whose compartments had been destroyed were reassigned to other duties. The wounded were being treated. There was even talk of getting the ship moving again, perhaps even recovering some aircraft if her flight deck could be cleared. Captain Sherman had begun to believe, and to convey to his officers and men, that the Lexington would live. She would limp back to port, she would be repaired, and she would fight another day. It was the kind of hope that men need in the aftermath of war, and it was, in that particular afternoon on the Coral Sea, a false hope that no one had yet realized. At 12:30 in the afternoon, a report came from below decks that made the hearts of the senior officers stop. The junior officers and sailors working in the lower machinery compartments, the deepest and most dangerous spaces in the ship, reported a strong smell of gasoline spreading throughout the ventilation system. The observation meant that avgas vapors had infiltrated the ship's air circulation network, which meant they were now present in sealed compartments throughout the vessel. The danger was acute and invisible, compressed in confined spaces, with air temperature rising due to the heat of the day and the residual heat from fires still smoldering in different parts of the ship. Those vapors were waiting for only one thing: a spark, a flame, a moment of ignition. The engineer officers understood the threat immediately. They ordered the ventilation systems shut down to try to prevent the spread of the vapors, but in doing so, they eliminated the circulation of fresh air through the wounded ship, making conditions below decks even worse. The heat accumulated, the vapors concentrated. Men were ordered to certain compartments to investigate the source of the smell and attempt to isolate damaged fuel lines, work of extraordinary danger in spaces that had become toxic. The situation was deteriorating, and the senior officers aboard knew it, though they did not yet know how swiftly or how completely the situation would spiral beyond their control. At 1:46 in the afternoon, the Lexington's terrible secret was revealed. In one of the forward compartments deep below the flight deck, in a space that had been damaged by the Japanese bomb and then isolated during damage control efforts, the accumulated avgas vapors found a source of ignition. Perhaps it was a spark from the electrical systems, damaged by the bombing and still attempting to function. Perhaps it was a piece of hot metal, warped by the concussions of the explosions, still radiating enough heat to ignite the invisible gas. The exact source would never be known with certainty. What was known was the result: a violent explosion that tore through the compartment with such force that the effects were felt throughout the entire ship. The blast wave was felt by sailors on the upper decks, a sudden and sickening shudder that ran from stem to stern. Officers looked at one another in alarm. What was that? Had they been hit again? Were the Japanese attacking? The questions came rapid and confused, but the answer came quickly enough. Reports flooded in from below. There was a fire, a major fire, in the forward lower compartments. The explosion had destroyed or displaced the shoring and bracing that the damage control parties had so carefully constructed. New flooding had been initiated. The fires that had been extinguished were rekindling in the spaces above the new blast. The terrible machinery of catastrophe had begun to wind itself up, and now it moved with unstoppable momentum. The senior officers aboard the Lexington understood, in the moments after that first explosion, that the ship was in mortal danger. Captain Sherman, still calm, still commanding with authority, began to issue the orders that acknowledged this reality. The attempt to save the ship would continue, but the preparations for the worst had to begin immediately. Watertight doors were ordered sealed. The crew was told to prepare for possible abandonment. Sailors who had been working below decks in the most dangerous compartments were ordered topside, away from the flames and the spreading vapors. The fire suppression systems, already taxed to their limits by the earlier blazes, were directed toward the new fires burning in the lower compartments. But the explosions continued. At 2:05, another massive internal explosion rocked the ship, larger and more violent than the first. This one was followed by another, and then another, as the accumulating avgas vapors throughout the ship continued to find sources of ignition in different compartments. The Lexington was being torn apart from within, her own fuel transformed into an invisible assassin that was destroying the ship far more thoroughly than any external enemy could have. The fires spread rapidly now, racing through ventilation ducts and along passageways, leaping from compartment to compartment. The smoke became impenetrable. Heat poured up through the decks. The explosions were now coming at intervals, a series of internal detonations that each one removed another part of the ship's ability to fight back. Another circuit of power, another battery of pumps, another group of men who had to be ordered away from the inferno. By 2:30 in the afternoon, Captain Sherman had made the decision that every commanding officer dreads, the decision that represents the final admission that the ship cannot be saved. The order to abandon ship was given. It was not given in panic or desperation, but rather as the logical conclusion to an impossible situation. The fires were spreading faster than they could be fought. The explosions continued at unpredictable intervals. The ship's list was increasing as compartments flooded faster than they could be managed. The crew, still numbering more than 2,000 men scattered throughout the vast hull, would not be able to defend the ship any longer. They would have to abandon her. The word spread rapidly through the ship, carried by officers and petty officers, conveyed through the smoke and chaos and terrible heat, spreading from man to man in compartments that had become mazes of fire and smoke. The crew responded with a discipline and order that would later be noted by every officer who witnessed it. There was no panic, no rush, no abandonment of protocol in the face of disaster. Instead, sailors moved in organized groups toward the deck, carrying the wounded, helping those injured and disoriented by the explosions and smoke, maintaining formation and sequence even as the ship burned around them. The incredible thing about the crew of the Lexington was not that they survived, but that they died. If they died at all, in good order and with dignity maintained to the very end. The evacuation of the ship proceeded with both speed and organization, as the Lady Lex continued her slow death around them. Sailors climbed out of the hull onto the flight deck, now a landscape of twisted metal and smoke, scattered with the wreckage of aircraft and the detritus of war. Those who could move went over the side, dropping into the sea where destroyers circled, ready to receive them. The water was warm and littered with oil and debris, but it was safer than the burning ship. Nets and lines had been rigged to help men clamber aboard the rescue vessels. Destroyers maneuvered as close as they dared to the burning carrier, their decks crowded with exhausted sailors pulled from the water, wrapped in blankets, given fresh water and reassurance. The rescue was the culmination of a terrible afternoon, the one bright spot in a day of loss. The discipline of the crew was noted and remarked upon in the after-action reports. There were no bodies floating dead in the water from the evacuation. Nearly 2,200 sailors were rescued from the Lexington. The ship had tried to kill them, and they had survived through discipline, order, and the care of their shipmates. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the Lexington was effectively abandoned, though a small number of senior officers remained aboard to conduct a final survey of the damage and to attempt to assess whether any hope remained for salvage or further rescue. They found none. The fires burned throughout the ship now, no longer confined to specific compartments, but spreading freely through vast sections of her hull. The ship's power was gone, the electrical systems dead, the fires spreading in the darkness, lit only by the flames themselves. The explosions had stopped, which meant that the avgas vapors had either burned away or exhausted themselves in detonation, but the damage they had caused was irreversible. The ship was finished. The final officers and men were ordered over the side, and the Lexington drifted in the Coral Sea with no crew aboard her, burning from within, a ghost ship crewed only by fire. The American destroyers circled at a distance, their crews watching in silence as the great carrier, which had survived every battle and every hazard since the beginning of the Pacific War, died in the afternoon sun. The final act came at close to 5 o'clock in the evening. The Lexington could not be allowed to remain floating, a prize for the Japanese fleet to capture or to sink themselves and claim a further victory. Captain Sherman, aboard one of the accompanying destroyers, made a decision that many commanding officers have had to make, but few have had to face. He ordered USS Hamon, one of the escorting destroyers, to finish the work that fire had begun. The destroyer moved alongside the burning carrier, and her officers prepared to deliver the final blow. Hamon maneuvered into position, her crew acutely aware that they were about to terminate a sister ship, one of the great warships of the United States Navy. At 4:51 in the evening, Hamon fired a torpedo at the Lexington's hull. The explosion tore open what remained of the ship's side and sent her into a rapid sinking. The great ship, which had served the Navy with distinction since 1927, which had participated in maneuvers and training, and finally in the desperate battles of the opening of the Pacific War, went down into the deep water of the Coral Sea. Her stern rose into the air as her bow plunged down. For a moment, she hung there, suspended between her old life and her grave, and then she was gone, slipping beneath the surface, disappearing into the darkening water, with a terrible groaning of metal and a burst of air bubbles that raced toward the surface. The Lexington was dead. The Lady Lex had been killed not by the enemy, but by her own fuel, and mercy killed by her own navy to prevent her desecration. The night that followed was one of strange, exhausted silence. The American task force regrouped, counted their losses, accounted for their rescued sailors. More than 2,000 men from the Lexington had been saved. The cost had been high. The great carrier herself, along with dozens of aircraft, and the energy and hope that had driven the crew through that terrible afternoon. But the ship's company had endured, and that endurance would be remembered. The destruction of the Lady Lex was not the end of the battle. It was instead a turning point, whose true meaning would only become clear as days and weeks unfolded. The Japanese had struck a great blow, sunk a great ship, and yet something had been preserved in the Coral Sea that May afternoon that would prove far more valuable than the hull and steel that had gone down. The American fleet had learned to fight in the age of the carrier. The crew of the Lexington had learned to survive in the face of impossible odds, and in the loss of one ship, the American Navy had preserved something more precious, the knowledge that they could endure, that their men would not break, and that the long war ahead, however terrible it might become, would not defeat them, before the war had truly begun. In the fading light of the 8th of May, 1942, aboard the heavy cruiser Miyoko, Vice Admiral Takagi received his first intelligence reports from the aerial search parties returning to the fleet. The pilot spoke excitedly of 2 large warships struck in the American force, both apparently crippled or destroyed. In the confused waters of the Coral Sea, where rain squalls had obscured the afternoon sky, and the boundary between triumph and disaster often remained unclear for hours, Takagi and his staff allowed themselves to believe what the pilots reported. The signals coming back suggested that the American fleet, the great prize that had eluded Japanese commanders across the Pacific for months, had finally been brought to battle and defeated. As darkness settled over the sea, the Japanese carrier force consolidated around its 2 fleet carriers, the Shokaku and Zuikaku, both still possessing flight decks and operational aircraft, both still capable of striking south. Takagi knew that preliminary reports from air combat were often unreliable, yet the weight of the evidence seemed to point in one direction: victory. The American carriers, he believed, were no longer a factor in the Southwest Pacific. The atmosphere aboard the Japanese flagship reflected this cautious optimism, mixed with the professional awareness that battle damage assessments often changed as damage control parties worked through the night. Takagi's staff prepared damage reports on both the Shokaku, which had taken multiple bomb hits and suffered casualties among her flight deck crew, and the Zuikaku, which had escaped direct attack but had lost a significant number of her aircraft in the day's combat. What mattered most, from a strategic perspective, was that both carriers retained enough undamaged capacity to continue operations. The Shokaku's hangar deck had been hit, and fires had spread before being controlled by her crew, working with extraordinary discipline in enclosed spaces filled with smoke and heat. Her flight deck, though charred and pitted with bomb fragments, remained capable of launching and recovering aircraft. The Zuikaku had suffered primarily from the loss of pilots and experienced air crews, rather than from physical damage to the ship herself. In the hierarchy of naval warfare, a ship could be repaired. Experienced aircrew took months or years to develop. Yet on the evening of the 8th of May, those losses were not yet fully calculated into the equation of victory and defeat. Admiral Shoji Nishimura, commanding the seaplane tender force, and the light carrier Shoho's escort, transmitted his reports of the destruction of his charge. The light carrier that had been sent ahead as an expendable shield for the main carrier force. The sinking of the Shoho was received with grim resignation rather than shock. In the calculus of Japanese naval planning, light carriers and older vessels could be sacrificed to achieve strategic objectives. What occupied the minds of Takagi and Admiral Inoue, commanding the overall operation from a cruiser further back in the formation, was a more pressing question. What came next? The invasion convoy carrying 3,000 troops destined for Port Moresby had halted in the waters north of the battle zone, awaiting orders. The commander of that transport force had been informed that the American carriers were either sunk or crippled, and the waters ahead were safe for the final approach to their landing beaches. Yet Takagi knew that preliminary reports could be catastrophically wrong. A second American carrier might still be operational, lurking somewhere in the darkness, gathering her surviving aircraft and preparing to strike at dawn. Or perhaps both reports were exaggerated, and the American ships had been merely damaged, capable of defending against the invasion fleet if it attempted to advance. The central dilemma confronting the Japanese command structure that night was fundamentally one of risk and incomplete information, a situation that had plagued military operations since warfare began. Should Vice Admiral Takagi use what remained of his carrier force to press the advantage and cover the invasion convoy for the final assault on Port Moresby, accepting the risk that American aircraft might still emerge from the darkness to challenge him? Or should he consolidate his position, repair the Shokaku as much as possible during the night, and prepare for a renewed engagement the following morning, when visibility was better and he could bring his full strength to bear? The answer to this question would depend on assessments of damage, fuel levels, ammunition expenditure, pilot fatigue, and the likely behavior of the American fleet, each factor carrying enormous weight, and none of them susceptible to perfect knowledge. Takagi consulted with his senior staff officers, men who had fought the Coral Sea campaign through all its phases, and whose professional judgment he trusted. The consensus that emerged, at least initially, was cautiously aggressive. The American fleet appeared to have been decisively damaged. The invasion convoy should press forward, under heavy air cover, from the remaining Japanese carrier strength. Port Moresby should be taken, while the American capacity to interfere had been crippled. It was Admiral Inoue who broke the circle of this reasoning, though not until after receiving further damage reports and reassessments from both the carrier force and the invasion fleet commanders. Inoue was not the dashing, aggressive carrier commander that popular imagination associated with Japanese naval operations. He was instead a man of careful judgment, inclined toward caution but not to paralysis, and he possessed a grasp of logistics and strategic realities that sometimes elevated him above the tactical considerations that consumed lesser commanders. As the evening wore on, reports arrived suggesting that one of the American carriers, the Yorktown, had actually survived the day's attacks and remained capable of operations, however limited. The source of this information was fragmentary, possibly unreliable, but it was enough to introduce doubt into the equation. Furthermore, reconnaissance flights sent out at dusk to locate the American fleet had returned with negative results. The American ships had not been found, which meant they could be anywhere in the darkness, ahead of the Japanese position, behind it, or alongside it, waiting for dawn to renew the fight. The thought of advancing the invasion convoy into waters where an undamaged or partially damaged American carrier could stage surprise attacks at sunrise began to seem less like tactical boldness and more like recklessness. By the early hours of the 9th of May, as the Japanese fleet moved through the night in formation, and the crews worked below decks to repair the Shokaku and count their losses, the tone of conversations aboard the flagship had begun to shift. Inoue, reviewing the battle's results with fresh eyes and consulting with his chief of staff, reached a conclusion that surprised some of his subordinates. The invasion convoy would be recalled. The Port Moresby landing would be postponed indefinitely. The carrier force would remain in the Coral Sea to guard against American interference. But the primary mission, the assault on Port Moresby itself, would not be pressed. The reasons for this decision were stated in professional language. The damage to the Shokaku required repairs that could not be completed at sea. The loss of aircraft and experienced aircrew from the Zuikaku had degraded her combat effectiveness. Reconnaissance indicated continued American naval presence, whose exact strength and position remained unclear. But beneath these operational considerations lay a deeper, almost intuitive calculation. Inoue sensed that whatever tactical victories the Japanese fleet had achieved that day, the strategic momentum had shifted. An invasion fleet without complete air superiority, approaching a beachhead against an enemy whose carrier force remained partially intact and vengeful, was an invitation to disaster. The debate over Inoue's decision was not uniform or immediate. Some of the younger carrier squadron commanders, flush with the day's victories and contemptuous of American capabilities, after months of crushing them in combat, urged continued aggression. The Shokaku could be repaired in the weeks ahead, The Zuikaku was substantially intact. Together, they could still protect an invasion convoy and pulverize any American aircraft that attempted to interfere. Port Moresby, they argued, was nearly within grasp. The opportunity that had been opened by months of strategic planning and the concentration of the Japanese fleet in the Coral Sea would be squandered if the invasion was postponed. But Inoue was unmoved by these passionate arguments. He had seen enough of modern naval warfare in the 8 months since Pearl Harbor to understand that victories on a single afternoon did not guarantee strategic success. The American industrial machine continued to pour out new ships and new aircraft. Every month that passed saw American naval strength growing rather than declining. An invasion attempt that failed, or succeeded only at catastrophic cost to the carrier fleet that covered it, would be a hollow victory at best. The decision was made. The invasion convoy would reverse course. The Japanese pilots and crew members aboard the carriers learned of the postponement with reactions that varied across the fleet. Some felt the weight of exhaustion and were relieved that the intense stress of the past days would finally ease. Others experienced frustration or even anger at the thought that Port Moresby, which had seemed so close, was slipping away into an indefinite future. A few officers quietly understood what Inoue's decision truly meant, even if they dared not voice it in the rigid hierarchy of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The unbroken string of Japanese victories that had begun at Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941 had finally encountered a check. Not a catastrophic defeat, not a reversal that would immediately change the strategic trajectory of the war in the Pacific, but a moment when the Japanese advance had been halted, when an operation that High Command had believed was nearly risk-free had instead proven costly enough to justify abandonment. The implications of this would not become clear for weeks or months. Only in retrospect would the commanders and historians understand that the Battle of the Coral Sea had marked a turning point, not because of what was destroyed, but because of what was not allowed to happen. Back in Tokyo, the Naval High Command received reports of the battle phrased in language of triumph. 2 American carriers had been sunk or disabled. The Japanese carrier force remained intact and ready for future operations. The enemy had been defeated in direct combat for the first time. The newspapers published accounts emphasizing the victory and the skill of Japanese pilots and sailors. The public mood remained one of confidence and expectation that the war in the Pacific would be decided in the coming weeks, with Japan emerging victorious and consolidating her new empire across the territories she had seized. In Canberra and Washington, however, military leaders understood something different. The messages intercepted from the Japanese fleet, the damage assessments of both fleets, and the abrupt Japanese decision to recall the invasion convoy combined to suggest that something crucial had shifted. The battle had been close, the American losses had been severe, but Australia had not been invaded. Port Moresby remained in Allied hands, the door through which the Japanese might have poured into the continent, shattering Australian strategic security and forcing a desperate concentration of American resources to salvage the situation, had been closed. Not locked permanently, but closed, at least for now. The true meaning of the Battle of the Coral Sea would not be fully appreciated by the men who fought it until long after the war ended, and historians could examine the documents, the operational decisions, and the long chain of consequences that flowed from the days of the 7th and 8th of May, 1942. On the surface, the battle appeared to be a Japanese tactical success and an American tactical failure. The Lexington had been lost, the Yorktown damaged. Japanese aircrew losses, while significant, had not removed the Shokaku and Zuikaku from future operations, at least not immediately. But buried within the details of the battle were the seeds of a very different outcome. The experienced pilots who had fallen into the Coral Sea would take their expertise and their memory with them. The Zuikaku had lost enough aircrew that her striking power was permanently degraded. The Shokaku, though she would sail and fight again, carried permanent reminders of the damage she had sustained. And Admiral Inoue's decision to halt the invasion, however tactically justified at the time, meant that Japan's southward advance had been arrested before it could reach the point of no return. In the days and weeks that followed, both the American and Japanese fleets would assess their losses and calculate their capacity for future operations. The Americans, despite their higher material losses, would conclude that their strategic goal, the defense of Australia, had been achieved. The Japanese, despite their tactical success, would struggle to explain why the invasion of Port Moresby had been postponed rather than pressed to completion. The question that would haunt Japanese operational planning in the months ahead was not whether they had won the Battle of the Coral Sea, but whether winning a tactical victory was sufficient when the strategic objective remained unachieved. As the two fleets withdrew from the Coral Sea in the days following the battle, each departing for their respective bases to repair, regroup, and prepare for the next engagement, the full weight of what had transpired in those few days of confused combat and missed opportunities would slowly become apparent. The Coral Sea had not been a definitive naval victory that one side could claim without qualification. It had instead been an encounter in which both sides had paid a price, but only one side had achieved its essential objective, the prevention of disaster and the preservation of the possibility of ultimate victory. For Japan, the experience was unfamiliar and would prove difficult to accept. In the wake of the 8th of May 1942, both fleets withdrew from the Coral Sea. The guns fell silent. The smoke cleared. What remained was not a moment of clarity, but a puzzle that would take historians decades to fully understand. To the men who had fought the battle, and to the high commands that had ordered them into the fray, the question burned with immediate urgency: who had won? The answer was not obvious. It would depend entirely on where you chose to measure victory, on the scale of tonnage sunk, or on the scale of strategic consequence. The Japanese Navy would insist, in its official communiques and in its internal assessments, that the Battle of the Coral Sea had been an unambiguous triumph. Yet buried in those victory reports lay the seeds of a catastrophe that would unfold precisely 1 month later at a place called Midway. Let us begin with the accounting, the cold arithmetic of loss. USS Lexington had gone down, and with her, her name was struck from the Naval Register forever. That was 36,000 tons of American carrier, sent to the ocean floor in one of the most dramatic ship losses of the entire war. The ship herself was worth far more than metal and machinery. She carried within her the accumulated experience of years of peacetime service, the institutional knowledge of her crew, the trust they had developed among themselves. Additionally, the Japanese had damaged USS Yorktown with bomb and torpedo hits that put her in serious condition, though she remained afloat and under her own power. From the American perspective, these were catastrophic losses to announce. 2 great carriers, or one destroyed and one crippled, represented the backbone of Pacific naval power. The American fleet had come to the Coral Sea with 2 fleet carriers. It was leaving with one, and that one requiring urgent repair. On paper, the arithmetic was stark. The United States Navy had lost more tonnage in this exchange than the Japanese had lost. The Nipponese Armada had sunk a heavy carrier, damaged another, destroyed assorted supporting vessels, and yet itself remained apparently intact and ready for further action. Yet the Japanese ledger, when examined carefully, told a different story. The fleet carrier Shokaku had taken multiple bomb hits that set her flight deck ablaze and forced her to withdraw from the battle, with her ability to launch and recover aircraft severely compromised. More damaging still, her boilers had been damaged. Her hull had been opened to the sea in several compartments, and the extent of her injuries would require months of repair in Japan's dwindling shipyard capacity. She would not return to combat operations until August, more than 3 months after the Coral Sea. Equally significant, though less immediately visible in battle damage reports, was the toll taken on her air group, the aircrew who had flown from her decks. These were not replaceable in the way that a damaged hull might eventually be repaired. Experienced naval aviators required years of training. Japan had lost many such men in the fighting, and the surviving pilots of Shokaku's air group had suffered profound losses among their comrades. The fleet carrier Zuikaku, for her part, had not taken a direct hit. She had managed to evade the American strike through skillful ship handling and the decisions of her captain. But her sister ship Shokaku's damage was so severe that the two carriers had operated as a tactical unit, and now that unit had to be broken apart. Zuikaku would be withdrawn from the forward area to allow her damaged consort to be towed toward Japan. These two ships, Shokaku and Zuikaku, had arrived in the Coral Sea together as the newest, most modern, and most powerfully equipped carriers in the Japanese fleet. They were leaving separately, and their air groups were shattered. Beyond the carrier fleet, both sides had lost smaller vessels in the exchange. The Japanese had lost the light carrier Shoho, the first Japanese carrier to be sunk by American action in the entire war. She had gone down swiftly on the 7th of May, caught on the surface, and overwhelmed by coordinated strikes from both Lexington and Yorktown. Her loss was significant not in tonnage alone. A light carrier represented only a fraction of the displacement of a fleet carrier, but in what it represented, the first visible proof that Japanese naval vessels could be sunk, that they were not invulnerable, that the string of Japanese victories could be interrupted. The Japanese had also lost the oiler Neosho, a support vessel that had been mistaken for a carrier in the confusion of the battle. She had taken bomb hits and eventually sank, her loss depriving the Japanese fleet of a vessel vital to sustained operations at sea. Additionally, the Japanese had lost the destroyer Sims while attempting to protect Neosho, sunk by American dive bombers in the attack on the oiler. On the American side, the losses extended beyond Lexington and the damage to Yorktown. Destroyers had been damaged, support vessels had taken injury, and dozens of smaller ships had been marked by the passage of Japanese ordnance and American determination to survive. The aircraft losses told an equally stark but differently weighted story. In the air battles of the 8th of May, when both fleets threw their complete air strength at each other, both sides had suffered severe attrition. American pilots reported the destruction of Japanese aircraft. Estimates varied and were often inflated in the heat of battle and the fog of reporting, but the actual figure of Japanese aircraft, destroyed and damaged, was substantial. However, the Americans had also lost significant numbers of their own aircraft. Dive bombers and torpedo planes that failed to return, fighters that had been shot down or damaged beyond repair, and the air crew who had flown them. Young men in their 20s, drawn from American colleges and farms, trained in American flight schools, and now gone beneath the waters of the Coral Sea. Every American pilot lost represented years of training investment and irreplaceable tactical experience. Yet here lay a crucial asymmetry in the nature of American and Japanese losses. An American pilot shot down over friendly waters near the American fleet, or who managed to ditch near an American ship, had a reasonable chance of rescue and recovery. He could rejoin his squadron after treatment for injuries or rest after shock. A Japanese pilot in the same situation hundreds of kilometers from any friendly vessel, in waters controlled by the enemy, had no such chance. His loss was permanent, absolute, and irretrievable. This distinction between recoverable and permanent losses became the hidden weight that tipped the balance of the entire battle. The Japanese could count their tonnage and declare victory. They had sunk a larger American carrier and damaged another. They had lost a light carrier and assorted supporting vessels, but the balance sheet in terms of displacement seemed to favor Japan. Yet the human cost of Shokaku's damage and the losses suffered by both Japanese air groups cut much deeper than any accounting of steel and wood could capture. The experienced pilots of Shokaku's air group, men who had trained for years in the Japanese Navy and had flown in combat since China and the opening of the Pacific War, could not be rapidly replaced. Japan's pilot training program was adequate for peacetime losses, but wholly unprepared for the scale of attrition that carrier warfare would impose. Every pilot lost was a permanent diminution of Japan's naval air strength. Moreover, the pilots of Zuikaku's air group, though unhurt physically, had suffered the psychological and emotional trauma of combat, of witnessing their sister ship's air group shattered, of seeing comrades die in the air and in the burning steel of a carrier's hangar deck. The condition of the surviving vessels further illuminated the true nature of the exchange. Yorktown, though damaged and requiring repair, could be towed to Pearl Harbor, where the American shipyards, miraculous in their speed and capacity, could work on her continuously in shift round-the-clock operations. The ship could be expected to return to combat operations within weeks, if the damage assessment proved favorable. American industrial capacity and American determination meant that Yorktown's time in the yards would be measured in weeks, not months. For Shokaku, the journey to Japan would take precious weeks, and the repair process, constrained by Japan's limited shipyard capacity and the competing demands of 100 other damaged warships, would extend months into the future. Japan's industrial base, though formidable, was already stretched thin by the demands of fighting across the vast Pacific and maintaining occupation forces across the conquered territories. Every dry dock space allocated to Shokaku was a dry dock space not available for another vessel. Every welder and rigger dedicated to her repair was a resource no longer available for ship construction. The Japanese Navy, unlike the American Navy, could not simply build new ships at will while repairing old ones. The margin was narrower, the resources more finite, the consequences of damage more severe and more lasting. The losses in human terms demanded acknowledgement, though they were less often discussed in the formal assessments of the battle's outcome. Both sides had suffered casualties among their sailors and officers. Lexington's crew had been largely saved through the orderly evacuation and the rescue efforts of surrounding destroyers, but nearly 216 men had died aboard her as a result of the initial attack and the subsequent explosions that led to her sinking. For Shoho, the loss of life had been far more severe. She had been struck so rapidly and so comprehensively that only a fraction of her crew had managed to escape before she sank. Over 600 men of her complement had gone down with the ship. The Japanese Navy would eventually account for these losses in its casualty reports, but in the immediate aftermath, there was a tendency to subsume individual deaths into the aggregate of victory. The men who had died were gone, and the focus of command turned toward the strategic implications of the engagement rather than the human tragedy of specific losses. Among the aircraft crews, the toll was equally severe, but again reflected the asymmetry of the war at sea. American pilots who ditched near their fleet had a chance of rescue. Japanese pilots who ditched away from their fleet did not. Many young men would not return home. The The battle's true arithmetic became visible only when analyzed through the lens of operational capability and strategic reach. The Japanese Navy, on the afternoon of the 8th of May, could claim that it had sunk more American tonnage than it had lost, that it had damaged a second American carrier, and that it still possessed 4 fleet carriers in the Pacific, Shokaku and Zuikaku in the Coral Sea region, though Shokaku was now damaged, and Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu far to the north, attached to the mobile force under Admiral Nagumo. By this measure, Japan had won. The invasion convoy for Port Moresby, though withdrawn, could be restaged at a later date. The strategic initiative remained with Japan. Admiral Inoue had recalled the convoy not because he had lost the battle, but because he judged that with one fleet carrier sunk and another damaged, the risk to the operation had become unacceptable. This was a rational calculation, but it was also, though few understood it at the time, an acknowledgement that the battle had imposed constraints on Japan's freedom of action that had not existed before. For the United States Navy and the American command structure, the battle presented a different appearance. On the surface, it seemed a defeat. Lexington was gone. Yorktown was damaged. The Japanese had seized the initiative in the Coral Sea and had even withdrawn their invasion threat, largely on their own terms. Yet beneath this surface lay a more complex reality. The American fleet had achieved something that had seemed impossible only months before. It had inflicted losses on the Japanese Navy, had damaged a fleet carrier, and had prevented the execution of a major Japanese offensive operation. The removal of Shokaku and Zuikaku from the order of battle, whether through damage or the need to conduct repairs and aircrew regeneration, meant that when the next major fleet engagement occurred, and both sides expected it would occur soon, somewhere in the vast Pacific, Japan would bring fewer carriers to the battle. This was a fact not yet understood in its full significance. No one, in those immediate days following the battle, could have predicted the exact timing and location of that next engagement. No one could have foreseen that it would occur in exactly 30 days, at a place called Midway. But the shape of that future battle was being determined here, in the Coral Sea, by damage reports and pilot casualties, and strategic calculations about when and how to continue the war. The battle, measured in isolation, looked like a Japanese tactical victory, earned through skillful seamanship and aggressive action. Measured in connection with what would follow, it looked like something far more consequential, the end of Japan's ability to prosecute its strategic objectives without accepting unacceptable risk. The Japanese had checked the American fleet, but they had not broken it. They had damaged an American carrier, but that carrier would be repaired and would return to service. They had sunk one American vessel of significance, but they had lost one of their own and damaged a second. Most significantly, they had suffered losses in experienced aircrew and in the cohesion of their carrier air groups that could not be quickly replaced and that would accumulate in consequence as the war progressed. Neither side understood, in the moments after the guns fell silent, that they were standing on a threshold. Behind them lay the period of easy Japanese victories, the run of conquest and dominance that had seemed almost inevitable in the first months of the war. Ahead lay a war of attrition, of industrial production, of pilot replacement and pilot training, of a nation's capacity to sustain losses and regenerate its strength. The Battle of the Coral Sea was the hinge on which the Pacific War turned, not because of what was won or lost in the battle itself, but because of what it prevented and what it cost to prevent it. The Coral Sea had been a draw. Both sides could make that claim with some justice. The Americans had lost a fleet carrier, and the Japanese had damaged theirs. The exchange appeared balanced, a fair test of strength that left neither side decisively ahead. Yet in that apparent balance lay a hidden arithmetic, one that would become the foundation of Japan's destruction just 30 days later. In early June 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto assembled the most powerful concentration of naval force the Imperial Japanese Navy had ever gathered. 4 fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, 2 battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and a transport fleet carrying more than 2,000 troops converged on the waters northeast of Hawaii. The objective was simple and audacious: destroy the American fleet's remaining carriers in a single, overwhelming blow, then seize Midway Atoll as a forward base to project Japanese power deep into the Central Pacific. In Yamamoto's calculations, this operation would finish what Pearl Harbor had begun: the elimination of American naval power in the Pacific. The plan was called Operation MI, and by every measure of contemporary military assessment, it should have worked. But the math of war, once begun, follows its own logic, and that logic was rooted in the Coral Sea, 1,000 kilometers to the south. The 2 Japanese fleet carriers that had emerged from the Coral Sea engagement were no longer whole. The Shokaku, although not sunk, bore the scars of a full-scale air attack. Bombs had torn through her flight deck and ignited fires in her hangar. She was being repaired, but the damage was substantial enough to keep her out of the coming operation. Her air group, seasoned pilots who had fought in the waters off China and Malaya, was scattered, some killed, others reassigned. The cohesion of the unit fractured. The Zuikaku had escaped physical damage in the battle, emerging intact and nominally ready for action, but her air group had suffered grievously. The trained, experienced pilots who had made the Japanese carrier force formidable through 2 years of war were gone, shot down, killed, or too damaged by combat to fly again for weeks. To replace them, the Japanese Navy was forced to draw pilots from training squadrons, young men with fewer than 200 flying hours and no combat experience. This distinction would become crucial. Yamamoto had expected 6 fleet carriers for the Midway operation. He would have only 4. The Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu would sail northeast, without Shokaku or Zuikaku. That loss of 30% of his carrier strength was a direct consequence of the Coral Sea. It was not the dramatic loss of ships sunk in harbor or the spectacular explosion of a battleship. It was the quiet attrition of damaged vessels in repair yards and the grinding depletion of irreplaceable pilot skill. In the language of logistics and replacement capacity, Japan's industrial base was simply not equipped to generate new carrier air groups quickly. The American Navy, by contrast, had massive training pipelines and could rotate experienced pilots home to train others. Japan kept its best pilots in the air until they were dead. The Coral Sea had accelerated that process significantly. The American fleet, preparing to defend Midway, labored under its own constraints. The Yorktown, having survived the Coral Sea, had been battered and was limping back to Pearl Harbor with her air group decimated. Naval engineers and yard workers had 96 hours to repair damage that should